He is Reinhard von Fuchlid, king of the unified continent. He told the young boy that he was likely to become a villain, and all the continents would perish by his hands. The king said that was the reason he had killed the boy countless times, but it was impossible to change his predestined fate. He had also witnessed countless failures, and saw the world destroyed every time, leaving only despair behind. So he decided to become even more ruthless. But in the end, on the day his grandson was born, he felt as if he were embracing hope. The boy was named Cain von Euclid. Now his grandfather wants him to follow his path, for if he cannot change the future, he will make sure the boy is strong enough to face the fate that awaits him. And so 13 years passed, and the protagonist went on a long journey with his grandfather. Currently, on the fourth continent, ruled by foreigners, a man is attempting to strike a deal, offering a woman as a bargaining chip. She begs to be saved, claiming she has children. On the other side, a lord's attendants beg him to do something. Then the lord asks the man if he feels no shame using a woman as a hostage, even as a warrior. The man replies that no matter what the lord says, the outcome depends on his decision, until suddenly someone appears, asking if this man is Kurogami Makuro, the black wolf demon. Kurogami asks who dares to confront him, and the protagonist simply says that Kurogami is about to fall to evil. Before he can do anything, the protagonist defeats him with a single blow. Apparently, his years of training have prepared him well, for he has a coldness in his eyes that mirrors the way he fights. The observing lord asks who this person is that just killed the hostile warrior, but the protagonist does not answer him, and soon after, he charges forward, defeating one of the lord's men. The lord sees this and is stunned. He quickly goes on the offensive, but the protagonist counters with ease, and the lord realizes he's lost control amidst the chaos. One of the lord's attendants prepares to defend him, and the protagonist simply stands there, watching her. Before being struck, he states that the hostage was an accomplice of the man who was killed. The lord refuses to believe that could be true, but the protagonist says that if they search their pockets, they'll find proof. They proceed to search their pockets. Then the lord finds a plaque bearing the Kokumi insignia, and is shocked by the revelation. After that, they thank the protagonist for his help, and he says he only did what anyone would have done. By the way, the lord asks how the protagonist knew the enemies were from Kokumi. He replies that he didn't know. He simply attacked evil. Later, the protagonist visits a tavern to report what happened, and there his work is praised, but his master still has some doubts, and asks how Cain was so sure the hostage was an accomplice. After all, she didn't seem like a hostile person. He then asks what Cain would have done if the woman were innocent. Cain simply says he was sure they were accomplices. He shows an item his master gave him years ago. This item revealed that the two were villains, which is why he was certain. The item is a sacred crucifix, a divine artifact from the third continent. Upon seeing his grandfather's reaction, Cain asks if this artifact was stolen. After all, his grandfather always told him never to commit bad deeds, but the grandfather says there was no other way, for there was no other means to interfere with his grandson's fate. Cain asks if it was truly necessary to steal treasures from other continents, but his grandfather tells him not to question him. Instead, he wants to know if it's true that the sacred item revealed the villains. The protagonist affirms this, claiming that the item revealed the dark side of those people, which made it easy to discern who was a villain or not. His grandfather says that the sacred ring recognized Cain, and finally his celestial Death Star was freed from the shackles of predestined fate. It truly is a terrible fate, to have to go so far just to finally reach neutrality with destiny. Cain has been with his grandfather for 13 years, yet still can't understand his view of fate. The grandfather tells him not to think too much about it, because if he knew what he knows, he'd be worried for the rest of his life. More than that, his body has become like a beast, and he states that Cain is undoubtedly his grandson. The protagonist asks if that's supposed to be a compliment. His grandfather says it depends on how he takes it. At night, they lie down to sleep. But before that, Reinhard tells his grandson that there's nothing tying him down anymore, so he can live freely from now on. Cain says that from good to good, and from endless malice to evil, he will live freely within the bounds of his grandfather's teachings. Hearing these words brings peace to the old man. The next day, the protagonist wakes up and sees a letter. It said it was a symbol of the end of his journey. His grandfather wrote it and guided him to walk his own life, free from fate. He also wanted to say something crucial. The grandfather made it very clear that no matter what anyone tells his grandson, he must never believe he is a villain. Lastly, he tells Cain to seek the blacksmith Kale in the central continent. He will become a valuable ally on his journey. After some time, Cain is already facing new enemies. He gives them no chance to recover and coldly defeats them with ease, until one of them says Cain isn't bad at fighting, but since they insulted Kuromi, he can't let him go. But this man wasn't prepared for what happened next, because the protagonist took him down and even threatened the remaining men. Even so, they didn't back down and went on the attack. Because of that, Cain couldn't just stand by and took down one of them, just like he did with their leader. As for the other, he let him live, and while beating him badly, the man begged for his life, but the protagonist didn't go easy on him. He says it's really hard to beat someone without killing them. Lying on the ground, the man says he's just a worthless member of his clan. The protagonist already knows that. The man asks how, and Cain says it's because he's white. He also says he sees potential for rehabilitation in this man, and suggests he reflect on his life in prison. After that, he picks up an enemy's sword and says it's not bad. He'll use it. And up above, he sees a fortress with a strong light shining. He remembers that he met the man who's emitting that light through his grandfather and says he'll lead the rest to him. Up high, an old man watches what's happening below. He sees that a foreigner defeated 20 Kurogami men at once, and beyond that, noticed his presence despite the distance. So he can't be an ordinary person. However, he wonders why this foreigner left one of the men alive, saying it's as if that man's fate had been entrusted to him, until his thoughts are interrupted by his disciple. She asks what the master is doing on top of this place. He replies that this is his resting spot. Then the master walks away from the disciple, but she follows him insistently. Shortly after, he reaches the survivor, saying he almost let him slip away. His student asks who this person is. He replies that it's a Kuromi. Right away, his student asks if she should kill him. The master says this man must be judged by the law, not executed, but the girl asks what would happen if he causes trouble again. Shorin says that those fated to become villains cannot be reformed and believes he should deal with him immediately. However, her master says that this was requested by someone whom this man attacked. Then Shorin asks how someone made that request from such a distance. She also doesn't believe her master's presence was detected from that far, since even the master's own students can't sense his presence when needed, including herself. She only found her master once because she knew that place was his favorite. In turn, the master says the child who located him has sharp eyes. The girl asks if the person who did this is the same age as her. Her master replies that yes, he is. He also sees that the sword used by this person broke, which means he cannot defend himself using only his inner energy. Soon, Shorin says that at the very least, the boy is superior to her in physical arts and swordsmanship. Central Continent, an autonomous region created to promote peace among all continents, where people from all over the world gather and live together. It is also a famous place, filled with specialties and renowned products from every continent. Right at the port is where trade happens. The protagonist goes there specifically to look for the man mentioned in his grandfather's letter, until he is approached by a girl who asks if he is interested in acquiring a fortune. However, the protagonist declines and starts to leave. Then she asks if the protagonist knows the priestess from the second continent, the one who can see destiny, and tells him to go find her. Another one approaches and says she would like to meet this seer, asking if the vendor could tell her fortune. The vendor asks what she would like to know. The woman says she can see the destinies of others, but not her own. The protagonist notices this woman and sees that she is from the Silver Fox clan. Then she turns and asks if the protagonist is bothered by her ears and tails. He apologizes for staring, but she says there is no need to apologize, and states that she just thought he might be interested in her. She says that's a destiny she would like to have, and also says they could gain fortunes together, one covering for the other, but the protagonist refuses. Then the woman says there's no deeper meaning behind it. It's her first time in the Central Continent, and she's a little hesitant to consult her fortune alone. Because of that, she says there's a gentleman also curious about his fate, so they could team up. But again, the protagonist declines and walks away. The fox girl says that in that case she will also go, and the vendor gets frustrated since she couldn't sell anything. On the other hand, the fox's companion asks if she should do something about it. She replies no. Her companion calls her princess and says those villains are using the fame of the priestess who can see fate. They're using her name for business. The princess says that if she reacts to every little thing like this, it'll never end. And besides, she's more interested in the man she met earlier. Muriel asks how she could have fallen in love at first sight, but the princess claims there was a misunderstanding about that. She says she was interested in that man because of what she saw about him. Muriel asks what that was. The princess refers to his fate, saying that even for her, someone who can see the destinies of others, she couldn't comprehend that man's destiny. She also says his destiny is perfectly flawless, colorless, and odorless. It was the first time in her life that had happened, so she couldn't help but speak to him. Muriel asks if they should investigate the protagonist's fate. The princess says no, because she believes she'll meet him again either way. Her companion reminds her that the fox girl said she couldn't see it, but the princess says that instead of his fate, she saw something else, and the two buy train tickets. The princess mentions that, strangely enough, they both shared the same destiny, and for some reason when she saw him, she remembered an old gentleman she met 10 years ago. He also had a mysterious destiny, and she wonders where he is and what he's doing now. Muriel suggests that this man might be the villain who stole the treasure. The princess knows he's a villain, but the old man told her that destiny is something you understand for yourself. If you can't see anything, you have to act on your own. For some reason, those words are stuck in her mind. That's why she tries to see something different from destiny. Unconsciously, she looks at the train ticket and feels a desire to meet him again. Meanwhile, the protagonist saw a silver-clad woman who seems to be the same age as him, and she was talking about destiny. So he wonders if she is the one his grandfather spoke about. He thinks about his own destiny. 3 stars strongly affect the constellation he was born under. One of them is a priestess who can see fate, a girl from the Silver Fox clan. She is fated to pierce his heart with a spear. But it's strange. The priestess who can see destiny is supposedly his enemy, yet instead of hostility, she showed kindness. Cain wonders if it's because his fate has tilted toward neutrality, and if that's the case, he wonders if other destinies have changed too. According to his grandfather's words, more than 20 people were fated to kill him, and those are the major destinies. If you include the minor ones as well, it's over 100. Twisting each of those destinies, escaping death. That is the initial and final goal of his journey. After traveling by train, he arrives at the capital Barakal, in the center of the continent, and comes across a shop called Iron Heart. Cain enters and says he's looking for something. The attendant asks what he needs. The protagonist says he's looking for the blacksmith, Kale Dipul. The girl thinks he wants a specialized weapon, and says that to see Kale, he needs an appointment. Instead, he shows her an item and asks if she can give it to Kale. She doesn't know what it is, but the protagonist insists that Kale will know and asks her to deliver it to him. Cain also doesn't know the contents. His grandfather told him not to open it and said that if Kale still refuses to meet after seeing what's inside, he'll leave peacefully. Then the girl understands and says Kale must be on his break and asks the protagonist to wait a moment. Meanwhile, Cain, through his amulet, senses that this girl is not evil. After waiting a bit, another blacksmith appears. He says the girl should have just kicked out such an annoying customer. Cain thinks that unlike the girl, this blacksmith is a bad person who deserves to be killed immediately. The blacksmith says that if someone wants to meet him, they should use money instead of such a poor method. And if they want to become VIPs, he'll definitely meet them. But the protagonist asks if he takes any responsibility. He also asks what kind of person calls themselves Heart and Iron. Cain sees a third-rate sword there that the blacksmith could take responsibility for. Despite his appearance, he seems to understand his place. But upon closer inspection, the swords look flashy on the outside but are poor in quality. It's a sword that perfectly matches this blacksmith, and judging by the blacksmith's reaction, he was the one who placed it there, probably to deceive travelers who aren't familiar with swords, and just by slightly swinging the sword, it broke, and the protagonist asks if the blacksmith intends to take responsibility. The blacksmith can't believe it, because regardless of the replica's quality, the sword broke with a single motion, until someone appears saying it's been a while since he visited the shop, but it looks like something interesting is going on. He is Kale, and he demands that the blacksmith explain himself immediately. The blacksmith tries to blame the protagonist for breaking the swords, and says the guard should arrest him. But Kale tells the deputy manager Din to shut his mouth, and asks why such trash was placed in this sanctuary. Kale is outraged at the manager, and demands an explanation, but the man's reaction says it all. Now he understands why the rumor about defects in their weapons spread. He states that such knowledge cannot be ignored, and tells Din to be ready, because he'll pay dearly for staining this store's name. Cal's assistants remove the man from the store as he begs for forgiveness, but instead he's called trash. In a desperate attempt, Din starts defaming the protagonist, claiming that he belittled Cal's swords, saying he couldn't guarantee their strength. He also said that even if Cain had money, he wouldn't buy third-rate swords, but Cal tells Din to shut up and says he'll deal with him later. Alone with the protagonist, Cal asks if what Din said is true. Surprisingly, Cain replies that it is. Cal says he had high hopes for him, because when he saw he had brought an item from his old friends, he was surprised. But now he tells Cain to leave and pretend this never happened. The protagonist sees that apparently this branch was what was in the box. After that, Cal gives him a reward, saying that among the items currently discarded, it's one of the 3 most famous swords, but apparently the protagonist didn't like it, and Cal remembers that he had said it wasn't worth buying, so he asks what Cain plans to do. Cain says his previous statement was insensitive, and he understands if Cal took it as an insult, but he claims it's a misunderstanding, and that he had no intention of belittling the swords. He simply told the truth because it's not just Cal's swords. Any famous sword cannot withstand his strength. Then the protagonist shows proof. When he strikes with the sword, it shatters into several pieces. Cal is astonished as he witnesses what the protagonist was talking about and finds his strength unbelievable. The Grandmaster Blacksmith says that this strength alone puts immense pressure on the sword. He then apologizes, stating he didn't mean to insult Reinhardt's grandson. However, Cain says he should be the one to apologize for being so rude. In any case, they settle things and sit down to talk. Cal is looking at the item the protagonist brought and claims that a mistletoe branch holds great meaning, but Cain didn't even know what it was. He simply says his grandfather instructed him not to open the box, but now he wants to learn more about the branch. The blacksmith says it's a treasure among treasures. In fact, it's called a divine artifact. Cain immediately concludes that his grandfather stole this item too. He then says that, for a divine item, the branch has a weak aura. But Cal explains that the branch is useful for crafting swords, and once complete, it would become a divine sword. Cal also says it's been about 20 years since he last saw one of these, and he asks for permission to forge a sword from this branch. Cain asks if Cal will give him the sword because, as he can see, he can't handle metal, and any sword he holds breaks before he can swing it 10 times. 10 years ago, after consuming the treasure of the deep sea, his body became unable to handle metals. Not just iron, but even materials like orichalcum and mithril are all destroyed when Cain touches them. It's no exaggeration to say that all existing weapons are made of metal. In other words, he doesn't have a weapon of his own. Cal says that hearing this reminds him of the story of the legendary creature of the ocean, and if that's Cain's condition, he understands why Reinhardt sent that branch. A weapon made of mistletoe wouldn't be affected by this condition. Cain asks if the blacksmith can make a weapon that won't be destroyed by his condition. He replies yes, and says Cain only needs to trust him with the task. The protagonist thinks he had nearly given up on ever having a weapon, and this seems to be the last gift from his grandfather. But as he leaves, he sees the blacksmith's assistant complaining about a problem. Cain approaches and tries to understand what's going on. He then asks if, by any chance, Manager Din ran away. She and the others apologize for letting the employee who insulted him escape. She states that Din deceived him and committed fraud, so she will make sure to catch him and bring him to justice. However, Cain asks if it's really necessary to apologize for letting him escape. Cain thinks they misunderstood him as a master from the 4th continent. They have strong personalities, so they assume that if someone holds a grudge, they'll be killed. The protagonist finds it a bit troublesome since he's not a master. If it were his grandmother in this situation, he imagines it would be much worse. The girl understands the protagonist's perspective and thanks him for it, but soon after, Cain leaves. And then, an attack event occurs. The leader of the bandits orders the others to capture the target, dead or alive. Whoever takes him down will earn 3 ounces of gold. Then the protagonist attacks him, saying that's a pretty good reward. He also says the man should protect his back better. But when he attacks, the protagonist's sword breaks, so the enemy takes advantage and counterattacks. However, the protagonist switches to hand-to-hand combat. The enemy tries to counter with his axe, but Cain grabs the axe and uses it against its original owner. One of his men starts to panic, but another tells them not to fear the target. Then the protagonist approaches and compliments his sword. He then uses it to pierce the enemy, More men appear and surround him. The protagonist takes the opportunity to strike them all at once, defeating the enemies who surrounded him. Some cowardly enemies are still alive and beg not to be attacked, claiming they have families. He defeats them too, mercilessly, until only one remains, and the protagonist says he'll let him live if he answers honestly. The enemy says he doesn't believe him and insists he'll die either way, but the protagonist says that if he doesn't believe, he can make a sword oath. This oath is highly respected in this world, so Cain swears by his sword that he'll keep his word. Now that he has made the promise, he asks the man who sent him. The bandit hesitates to respond, so the protagonist stabs his leg, asking if he's really going to refuse to answer. Agonizing in pain, the man replies that Din Kospel sent everyone, something the protagonist had already suspected, and asks what path the request followed. The man says there's a large organization based in Barakal. Din used his connections to get them involved. The fact that Din is part of a criminal organization is not surprising, and Cain assumes that working as a fraud in the shop wasn't the full extent of what he could do. Then he asks where the organization's base is. The man says there are several, but Cain doesn't want to know everything. He only wants to know where Din operates. The man says the lawn rest stop is the main base of operations. The request came from there too, and the rest stop is nearby. To be sure, Cain asks if the bandit is lying. The man insists he's telling the truth. Then the protagonist pulls the sword from the bandit's leg, and the man asks if he can go now. But Cain says no, and states that he's going to kill him. The bandit starts crying, saying the protagonist made a sword oath. But Cain replies that the oath doesn't apply to him, because ever since he ate the celestial peach, mana disappeared from his body. The restrictions that are bound to mana no longer applied to him. The bandit then says that even so, a warrior should keep his word. Cain agrees with that. However, he says that for everything, there is an exception. He claims that a promise made to a villain is meaningless. After finishing off the bandit, his sword breaks again. Cain thought he could still use it for a while, but it didn't even last 10 strikes this time. As expected, he concludes that he needs a sword that doesn't break. Upon arriving at the location, it looked like a normal inn from the outside, but that only applied to the lobby and exterior, because the protagonist knows that by using the hidden passage, one can reach the basement. There some men are talking, and one says he heard that his friend finished a job today. The other says he was lucky to find a rich young master and cut off his head. It was a place where all kinds of dangerous criminals lived, and by the way, he asks where his friend found that brat. Then someone approaches, clearly furious. It's Din Kospel, who's enraged to learn that his men failed to kill the protagonist. He tells an assassin that if he had known the man was coming, he wouldn't have assigned the task to his own men. Din thinks that this man is a skilled figure, even known in Atla. Sending him must mean his boss has certain expectations for him. So Din asks the masked man if he's making his move now, but the masked man doesn't understand the question. Then Din asks if the masked man isn't there to help deal with the target. The masked man says the only orders he received were to retrieve the information provided by Ironheart, and asks if Kospel still has anything to report. Din thinks that if he hands over that information, he'll die soon after, but he has no choice since the assassin won't return empty-handed. He then gives him what he has, and the masked man is satisfied. Soon, he gets up to leave. That surprises Din, who thought he was going to die. However, the masked man tells him to be quiet, saying it's too silent outside. On the other side of the door, the kidnapped boy had been told to count to 20 and keep his eyes shut. Then he asks if he can open them now, but the protagonist says not yet and puts him to sleep. The protagonist says everything's okay and tells him that when he opens his eyes, he'll be in his mother's arms. After that, Cain realizes he's not alone. The masked man asks who he is, and Din replies that this is the target he had mentioned earlier. Upon seeing the protagonist, the masked man says he's rather cruel for someone so young, and asks if it was really necessary to go so far and be so ruthless. Cain responds by saying it's ridiculous for an assassin to know the meaning of the word cruel. The masked man says all he did was decapitate the man who bragged about decapitating others and torture those who love to torture others. He also says the protagonist's opponents were weak and thinks it would have been good to show a little mercy. Cain then asks, why? Cain says that good for good and endless malice for evil. He declares that mercy is a world unfit for his enemies, and all he can offer is endless malice. The masked man becomes extremely frightened and doesn't quite understand what the protagonist is talking about. But before he realizes it, there's a sword at his neck. The protagonist manages to slash him, but his sword breaks. Even so, the wound inflicted is enough to injure the enemy. Din sees this and tries to escape, but the protagonist tells him not to move because his turn is coming. Cain sees the masked man fallen and defeated, and feels satisfied as he finally confronts Din Kospel face to face. Din, in turn, can only scream in despair. After all that, the protagonist returns to the blacksmith's shop and says that, in other words, Din was a member of Atla. Not only that, but he was just about to report something. He hands over the chip he took to Kale and says that for safety reasons, since this model came out before mass production, it will be difficult to find a tablet for it. Kale then says that figuring out what information Atlas stole from his workshop will take some time, and he doubts he even knows what they're aiming for. That makes him uneasy. Cain says that, for now, the blacksmiths should be cautious. They don't know what Atla is planning. Kale says he won't be able to forge the sword if anything happens to him. Kale also asks about the child. The protagonist says he saved him from the bandits and asks if the blacksmith would take care of him. He explains that he doesn't trust anyone else with the boy. Kale then says he'll take on that responsibility. Cain thanks him for the help. Before he leaves, the blacksmith says he found a hidden compartment in the box from the protagonist's grandfather and discovered something, and says that the protagonist should be the one to keep it. Cain thanks him and says he'll contact the blacksmith once he finds a way to read the contents of the chip. After that, he says goodbye and leaves. Far from there, the Fox Princess and her companion arrive at the place where the protagonist was last seen, but they still don't know who caused all the destruction. She wonders if there's someone capable of wielding such power against Atla. Her companion says that, as far as she knows, there's no one like that in the central continent. The princess asks if whoever did it might be on their side. Her friend doesn't know, but states that whoever did this is cruel, so she doesn't think it's something to be pleased about. The fox girl feels that the person went too far. Her friend says it's not a bad thing to get rid of bandits using brutal methods, and she likes having people like that around. However, they might be the type who are impossible to reason with, but the princess feels like she's seen those methods somewhere before, and says it would be good to have more people like that in other continents too. Her friend says it's possible that more people are fighting against the Atlas across the world. The princess says that whether or not that's true, she'd like to meet those people, and her friend says she'll investigate them. Late at night, the protagonist reads his grandfather's note. His grandfather wrote that if Cain is reading this letter now, then that means he went to the central continent and met Kale. He probably gave him a mistletoe branch and then asked for a sword. After that, he must have also met the priestess who can see destiny. The protagonist thinks it was all a coincidence and wonders how his grandfather could have predicted it all. His grandfather continues, writing that Cain clashed with Atla and Barakal, and if everything goes according to what he wrote, his grandson will lose his life to Atla. The protagonist walks, thinking that his body isn't in good shape right now, and if he still had mana, he wouldn't be so exhausted. Cain thinks that those who have mana don't need to sleep much, since mana energizes both the body and mind. It also helps them recover from fatigue, so they don't need much sleep. He thinks he has to do something about this drowsiness, and tries to buy a tablet, but can't. Soon, he finds a store that might have what he needs, and enters, hoping they have it. But shortly after he enters the shop, the Fox Princess and her companion also walk in. She tells the shopkeeper that she's looking for something, an old tablet whose model name starts with TK. The vendor asks if she means the TK32DX2. He says it's becoming popular again because recently, a charming collector also asked about it, and he warns that the last one he had was sold to that young man. Her companion says there's no way an ordinary person could afford such an old device. The princess asks if it might have been someone from Atla. Her companion responds that it's possible and says they should try to track down the buyer. So the princess appeals with her cuteness, claiming she really wants to see the device, and she tries to get some information from the seller about who bought the device. Meanwhile, the protagonist inserts the chip into the device, and he's immediately able to see the information. He realizes it's personal information about the blacksmith from the Iron Heart. Upon seeing this, he thinks it's best to inform Kale as soon as possible. But right after, he ends up encountering the priestess and her companion. Cain wonders how long she has been following him. While the girl speaks, he only notices her guardian, who remains alert at all times, until something surprises him. The princess approaches the protagonist and says the strangest thing is that she still can't see his future. Her companion tells the princess to stay focused on the more urgent matters. She agrees and asks if the protagonist is a member of the Atla. This shocks her friend as the princess was very direct with the question. Kane simply responds that he's not an Atla, quite the opposite, as he declares he's against them. Then someone shows up and interrupts the conversation. The man says he was already expecting someone to bite the bait, though he didn't imagine it would be the princess from the second continent. She recognizes this man as the Atla executive named Show Python and asks what he's doing there. While her friend stands protectively in front of her, the Atla member says it's been a while since they last met, and that's why he claims he wanted to show up personally to welcome her. However, the princess's companion tells him not to come any closer. Python says he won't, but asks why the princess decided to appear in the central continent. The princess doesn't answer, but he knows she's been investigating something about a device, and he notices that this device is in the hands of the protagonist. Kane speaks up and says it wasn't the princess who bought the tablet, but him, and asks how the man tracked the device. The Atla says they intentionally placed devices like these in secondhand shops to lure enemies of their organization, and for that reason, he thanks them for biting the bait. Regardless, he doesn't know who the protagonist is and asks why a random person would be interested in such a device. Kane gives an evasive answer, but the man starts laughing, saying he doesn't seem like a threat, but he wants to see how they'll react to this. Then, using a remote control, he activates several speakers, the noise from which severely irritates the fox girls. This acts like a weapon against beast humans, though normal humans aren't affected. Python claims the girls will pass out, and when they wake up, they'll be in an underground prison. The princess's guardian looks at her lying on the ground and apologizes for not protecting her. Up to this moment, the protagonist hasn't reacted. Python says he's been watching him and didn't notice anything special about him, but he can't let him go since he needs to find out how the protagonist is involved in all this, and says he'll take him to their base for questioning. He also says he doesn't intend to hurt him, but will place handcuffs on him until they arrive, and even thanks him for helping capture the princess. Kane notices the cuffs are made of iron, so they'll be useless against him, and agrees to go with the enemy, intending to fake cooperation to learn more. Some time passes and the guardian wakes up. She tries to move, but can't, as she soon sees that she's handcuffed. She becomes worried about the princess, and the protagonist says she was taken a few minutes ago by the enemies. Nuriel notices there are no guards around, and asks if the protagonist is also an enemy of the Atla. Kane says the enemies are planning to take her sword, since there's only one like it in the world, so he can't give it up no matter what. That's why he'll crush them. The Guardian says he still doesn't understand the situation and asserts that being trapped in these cuffs means he won't be able to escape easily, since even she would have trouble doing so. The protagonist simply says the flaw in these cuffs is that they're made of iron, and states that something like that can't hold him. Right after, he breaks the cuffs. He also offers to free the girl. Quickly, she's freed as well. Not only that, but the protagonist uses his ability to break the iron bars of the prison. Then he says he knows the path to where the princess was taken, and tells Nuriel to follow him. Meanwhile, the princess remains imprisoned elsewhere, and Python says Din Kospel became useless after dying, but he's happy to have finally captured the Priestess of Destiny. He also says he's grateful because thanks to this, he'll be promoted within the organization. Looking into her eyes, he says he feels an urge to rip them out and then stare at them forever. Just thinking about it makes his heart race. The princess replies that instead, she will rip his eyes out and use them as decoration. Then Python says she has a sharp tongue, and he finds that attractive. He also says his boss won't like this, but there won't be much trouble if he only rips out one of her eyes. She resists and says she will repay all the humiliation she's been put through. Until Python hears someone telling him to behave. He asks who dares to interfere in his business, but as he turns around, he gets kicked by the protagonist. Not only that, Kane builds up momentum and attacks him again, not giving his opponent a chance to react. After that, he goes to the princess and asks if she's okay. She says yes and thanks him for the help. Then the protagonist breaks her shackles and says her guardian is outside. The princess wonders how he broke the shackles so easily, but before leaving, she asks if he isn't going as well. Kane says that before that, he has an interrogation to carry out, and tells the princess to wait outside with her friend. Once freed, the princess leaves the room and runs into her friend. They are both happy that nothing serious happened, until they start hearing some screams from inside and wonder what is going on. The princess says the protagonist is interrogating Python, and Nuriel says he broke the chains easily earlier and starts to worry about who he really is. Then Kane appears and apologizes for the delay, saying they can leave now as the place is dangerous. They ask what happened to the man who was being interrogated. Kane says he's dead and recommends they don't go in there. However, Nuriel says she needs to see it with her own eyes, but upon doing so, she regrets it because the scene she sees is horrendous. After that, they leave, and the protagonist says it's no wonder he hadn't found them earlier. After all, they set up a base on top of a mountain. Before continuing, he wants to talk for a bit and says he has something to tell the princess. He shares information about the device that neutralized the two of them before, a device that was specifically developed for beast humans. It basically forces an overload, suppressing blood flow. Kane couldn't fully grasp the detailed principles, and even Python didn't completely understand it. Nuriel says that even if they lose their strength, it's best not to use blood flow for a while. Then she and the princess thank the protagonist for this information and for helping earlier. Kane says that's not necessary. He claims that what mattered most to him was uncovering the Atla's goals, and he found out they want to collapse the entire central continent. By doing so, they would force the breakdown of peace between the 4 continents and use their influence across all of them to start a war. This way, they plan to weaken the military forces of the continents and exploit their weaknesses to dominate the world. The girls are horrified by this. Kane now understands his grandfather's words. In any case, he says that's all for now and that they should part ways. The princess says she hasn't properly thanked him yet and wants to bring him to her base. However, he says he has more urgent things to take care of, thinking that the Iron Heart shop could be attacked at any moment, so he has to return there as soon as possible. The princess doesn't let him go without a promise that they'll meet again. Kane then sets a meeting with her for the next day and says he'll be waiting at Sarah's tavern at 6 in the morning. After that, he leaves by jumping to higher ground, and Nuriel praises his skills, saying he always has a trick up his sleeve. She even compares him to the Beast King. On the other hand, the princess thinks differently. She asks her friend if she doesn't feel like this is somehow fated, since this young man is the only one in the world whose future she can't see, and he saved her life. Speaking of the protagonist, late at night, he arrives at the blacksmith's shop, and Kale asks what he's doing there so late. Kane says he accessed the chip's information and tells the blacksmith everything. After hearing that, Kale can't believe all this was happening, and he had no idea. Kane says the Atla intend to go to war, so it's only natural they were targeting a blacksmith, especially to get the best weapons. For now, he advises the blacksmith to hide somewhere with the artisans, but Kale says that's impossible, because if he's discovered, the Atla will launch an attack. He also says that because the protagonist attacked their base, he's now being hunted. Kane apologizes, but the blacksmith reassures him. He says he'll forge the sword anyway, but there's a problem and asks Kane if he knows about Suritratin. He explains that it's a precious metal from the second continent, which is necessary for the sword's construction. But obtaining it is very difficult, and it will take a long time to finish the sword without it. However, Kane says he knows a way to get that material. He thinks the princess can foresee destiny, and when he meets her, he asks what she knows about the metal. They meet at the tavern as planned, and the protagonist asks how he can obtain Suritratin. She says acquiring it isn't the issue, but explains that it will take some time, and she asks if it has to be unprocessed. The protagonist says yes. In that case, the princess says she can get it immediately, but her companion doesn't like the idea. The princess points to Nuriel's sword, but her guardian says that sword is a gift directly from the king, and she doesn't want to give it up. However, after much insistence, Nuriel gives up the sword. The protagonist thanks her and says that if the princess needs information from other bases, he will provide it. She finds that a little suspicious and asks what the protagonist's motivations are. Kane says that even if he doesn't like it, he needs to form a team. The princess asks if he's trying to form an alliance. Kane says that, as she can see, he's always on his own, but to face the Atla, he'll need allies. Then the princess asks if he trusts her. Kane says yes, and states that just by looking, he can tell they're strong. He also says he'll understand if they don't trust him right away, but the princess immediately counters that, saying she trusts him. With that, they agree to join forces. The protagonist says he doesn't know how long they'll have to work together, but says that, in the meantime, they should look out for one another. That way, he gets ready to leave, saying he needs to deliver the sword as quickly as possible. Before he goes, the princess gives him a map of where they're staying and says he can visit them anytime he wants. And she also says one more thing. She reveals that her name is Shiver Vistran. Only now does the protagonist realize that neither of them had introduced themselves formally, so he says his name is Cain. The princess says that's a beautiful name and says she'll see him soon. Sometime later, the protagonist walks under the moonlight. Meanwhile, he thinks about how he has the Black Wolf's sword, probably the only one in the world, and has already delivered it to Kale, so that issue is settled. This way, in a week, his sword will be complete, and he'll never have to worry about constantly breaking equipment again. So he decided to go to the address the princess gave him earlier, and is surprised when he arrives. He says that, unfortunately, the rum was sold out and he couldn't buy any. However, Nuriel welcomes him and says he got there quickly. She's surprised since the protagonist had said his task was urgent. He confirms and says it was urgent, not time-consuming. Inside, a beast man wonders why Python had the noise suppression device. He had that question in mind, but didn't expect the answer to show up right in front of him. When he sees the protagonist approaching, the beast man gets scared, but Cain tells him not to play dumb, stating that he knows exactly who he is. Cain then cuts off the beast man's head, shocking everyone present. Then he says his introductions were delayed because someone got in his way, so he formally introduces himself and says he'll be living with them for a while. He then wishes for everyone to get along. After the protagonist's dramatic entrance, he draws everyone's attention, and soon he is attacked by the dead man's friends. His actions are not well received, so the others begin to attack him as well. The protagonist tries to argue that this is all just a misunderstanding. Either way, he defends himself from the attacks, until suddenly he notices that Nuriel is just watching the fight and has no intention of stepping in. Even so, he keeps fighting, but while defending from an attack, his sword breaks as always. So with no other option left, he resorts to talking, claiming that the man he killed was a spy. It's hard for the others to believe, but the protagonist insists it's true. Nuriel speaks up and asks how he's so sure about that. Cain asks if she's ever heard of the Jifril school. He explains that it's a school focused mainly on body-based magic, and one of those magics is specifically body transformation. As soon as Cain cancels the spell, the others are shocked to see the true face of the dead man. The protagonist says that the magic stone inside this individual's body was responsible for the transformation, a spell that perfectly copies another person. And because of that, he claims the man was a spy for the Atla. However, Nuriel still has a few doubts. First of all, she asks how he knows so much about magic when he's just a swordsman. Second, she wants to know how he was so sure that individual was a spy. To the first question, he answers that he knows all 73 magic schools on the continent and their traits. And to the second, he attributes it to an unavoidable accident caused by his obsessive-compulsive disorder. Cain recalls that his grandfather once said the malice within him is immense and hoped that it would only be directed toward a single purpose, and that when the time came to destroy evil, his grandfather said he shouldn't hesitate and should act purely on instinct. That's why Cain says his body reacts almost unconsciously in the presence of evil. Nuriel understands and says that next time he should share his plans before acting. Cain apologizes and says he'll try to stay in control from now on. He also says he spoke to the princess about what happened earlier and that a proper reward has been prepared for him. Cain asks where the princess is. Her friend reveals she's praying on the top floor and needs some time alone. She says there's no danger where the princess is, but then remembers that the person who prepared the altar was exactly the one who died. So Nuriel rushes to meet the princess. But when she gets there, she sees that nothing serious is happening. The princess says that her friend's appearance must mean the lower floors were attacked as well. Her friend replies that it's more complicated than that. She says Nuriel made the right decision because few could defeat her now, especially since the princess cannot be assassinated under the full moon. She also says she was attacked out of nowhere, so she used a lot of strength and regrets it, because if they had survived, they could have been captured for more information. Suddenly, she senses a strange presence nearby and runs off to see what it is. The princess thinks the intruder is hiding their presence, but says her eyes won't be deceived under the moonlight. Nuriel warns the princess to be careful, and thinks the only person who could have triggered that presence the princess sensed must be Cain. She knows the princess's powers under the moonlight rival the Beast King's in his youth. Therefore, if Cain is attacked by her in that form, he won't be able to defend himself. until the princess attacks Cain and he says she's stronger than he expected. She becomes incredibly embarrassed for attacking him by mistake and apologizes, saying she thought he was an intruder. On the other hand, Nuriel is amazed that Cain was attacked by the princess and didn't take any damage, becoming even more impressed with him, because this might mean he's stronger than the Beast King. Sometime later, he shares the details with the princess and asks if there could be any connection between the Jifril school and her ability to see destiny. She says she has the power to see other people's destinies as long as she can see them with her own eyes, and there are no other conditions, and she believes it works by observing the target's mana. In other words, this power depends entirely on the target's mana, so if they have little mana, they can't be seen. Cain thinks that no one with mana can hide from the priestess's eyes. In terms of detection skills, that's an overwhelmingly powerful ability. Meanwhile, Nuriel asks why the princess would reveal such a secret so easily. She responds that the secret is worth less than her life. Concerned, Nuriel tells the protagonist that this information about the princess must not become public. However, Cain's expression changes completely. He says that, judging by the princess's reaction, she hasn't realized it yet, and claims that they are surrounded. Outside, some spies are watching them. Ratman, a member of the Atla, says that while they were fighting there, the infiltrator was playing spy. He was happy to be assigned to the item, so he should have stopped slacking and gotten the job done, and says that once this task is over, they're going to kill him. But Rashid says there's no need, since transformation through magic is high risk, so the infiltrator will be discovered and die on his own. Raman then concludes that the infiltrator was sent for that very purpose, but Jay, another member of the organization, doesn't like hearing that. He says the infiltrator hasn't reported back for about 30 minutes and is worried. Ratman says it's just a matter of time until they get word from the infiltrator, but the two can't agree and are about to fight to the death. Meanwhile, the commander simply watches them and then says he'll kill anyone who draws a sword in front of him, so if they want to continue, they can go ahead. The two fighters quickly back down, afraid of their superior. Then the commander orders Jay to go check on the infiltrator's status, and if there's no contact, they'll proceed with the plan. Ratman gets excited, thinking he'll finally get the action he wanted. However, when he looks to the side, he no longer sees his companion and is shocked by the scene. He tries to warn Jay that they're under attack, but when he looks at Jay, he sees that he's already been taken down. The protagonist approaches, saying he suddenly felt the bloodlust and thought he'd been discovered, but apparently he was mistaken. Ratman, terrified, asks who he is. He gets no answer and demands that the man in front of him identify himself, claiming that if someone asks a question, they deserve a response. But then Cain asks if Ratman is even a person, saying he's just a piece of meat, about to be chopped into pieces. After defeating the Atlas spies, Cain picks up a sword from one of them and hopes it lasts at least 3 days. The next day, Nuriel says the enemy has found them, so they need to abandon this base and find a new location, and also discard anything that might leak information, taking only the essentials. Soon after, the protagonist returns. Nuriel thanks him for the help and asks how many enemies there were and what the commander's face looked like. Cain, in turn, asks if that really matters. She says it does, because that way they can prepare for what's coming. Cain says all the opponents perished. Nuriel is shocked, not believing that he defeated them all in just 3 minutes, until she sees the protagonist holding a new sword. He says he took it from one of the enemies. Nuriel says that's a sacred magic sword and is surprised to see it. Cain says its former owner was called Rashid, one of the Outlaw members, and the sword is Reshabertan. They say there's nothing this magic sword can't cut. In fact, he thought the mana density was high, so he concluded it was a magic sword. Nuriel says he should have known that. It's common knowledge among all swordsmen, but Cain says he's not familiar with swords. Speaking of which, Nuriel realizes that Lord Cain also didn't know about the Black Wolf's sword and wonders if he might not be a swordsman at all. The princess, who had been quietly sitting in the corner until now, stands up and apologizes for the delay, saying her synchronization is complete. Cain realizes she was gathering strength to return to this state. She thanks Cain for his help, but says to lead the rest to her. The protagonist quickly realizes she had been listening to their conversation the whole time. Cain tries to warn her about the enemies, but the princess says she'll take care of them all. However, he says that's not it, and reveals that he already defeated them all, leaving the princess speechless. Far away, in the capital of the second continent, in a small company located in Sorakasia, a man receives the news that they've lost communication with the swordsman. He is Van, the Thunder Emperor and executive of the Atla, and he asks his assistant if Rashid was taken down, claiming someone that strong shouldn't fall so easily. But unfortunately, his secretary confirms it and says something unexpected may have happened. She says she heard that the Princess of Vistram awakened her power and became stronger than King Fur, so that power may be what led to Rashid's defeat. Van says that indeed, if the princess's blood awakens, it will be significant, and if that hypothesis is true, it'll be a big problem for them. The assistant says she'll check these facts through the intelligence network, and reviewing the plan to subjugate the Beast King will be considered afterward. Van says that regarding the capture of the princess, since Rashid failed, they need to devise the next plan. His assistant says that on that matter, preparations are already underway as a backup plan is in place for any eventuality. He then says he'll leave that to her and focus on the current matter, claiming that the princess won't escape next time. The next day in the ruined forest at the top of Baracle Tower, the protagonist has a scheduled meeting with the princess and her guardian, but he ends up arriving 2 hours early. He quickly realizes he can't just stand around doing nothing, so he decides to meditate. With that, he remembers what his grandfather once said, that originally, the body follows the mind, and the mind follows the body. Once his grandfather asked which he thinks comes first, and if he doesn't know, then he should think until he understands. That is his first task. The protagonist wonders if he'll find the answer to that today. Nearby, the princess and her guardian are approaching. She says awakening her blood flow twice in one day was too much, and asks if they're walking in circles. Muriel says that's strange because this isn't place they're visiting for the first time, so they shouldn't be getting lost. The princess asks what this unusual atmosphere is, and her friend suggests it might be a divine object and wants to get there quickly. Eventually, they arrive where the protagonist is. Upon seeing him lying down, surrounded by animals, the princess thinks he looks just like a painting she once saw. However, in a brief moment, the protagonist feels something dark within himself. Kane thinks it's happening again today. Ever since he ate the celestial peach, he hasn't been able to use mana. However, during introspection, his mana returns temporarily. He wonders if mana is continuously present during introspection, or if it only returns momentarily during that state, but concludes that this too won't be answered today, until he sees the silhouette of two girls and returns to a normal state, asking how long they've been watching him. They say for about 5 minutes. The princess noticed Kane didn't sense them and wonders if it's because his mind and body didn't feel any danger from them. Then Kane greets them, and the princess is startled. She apologizes and says she was lost in thought. 20 minutes later, they are gathered with the others. The allies apologize for being late, but Nuriel says they shouldn't be apologizing because it was Kane's fault. The protagonist doesn't understand what she means. She says the mana Kane released turned this forest into a labyrinth, but from his reaction, Nuriel realizes the protagonist didn't do it on purpose, and that, in a way, he was connected to nature, becoming one with it, just like the supreme fruit, the one that concentrates the aura of the celestial realm in one place, the celestial peach. Since the celestial realm is nature, the energy it emits is also the same as nature. Kane wonders if the natural aura flowed from the celestial peach during introspection. This is good information. It brings him a step closer to solving the task. Nuriel says they should now begin the meeting before it gets too late, and first wants to review the current situation. Meanwhile, the princess wonders what that darkness black as jet was. She also questions if this is Lord Kane's destiny. She believes in Lord Kane, but if that's the case, she doesn't know how to respond to what she witnessed. Nuriel says the briefing is now over and orders the others to act immediately. They organize into groups like the communication department, the group's supply team, and also a reconnaissance group that sets magical alarms around the forest. Kane praises Nuriel's leadership abilities. She says she returned to the second continent for regrouping, but felt bad for leaving after he had helped. Kane tells her not to worry about that, because there's still plenty of time, and he's sure the day will come when she'll help him. Nuriel says she'll be returning in the royal airship in 4 days, so if Kane needs anything, she offers to help. Then the protagonist asks if that's her sound link. Nuriel only says that apparently, Atla has begun to move. Kane asks if they're coming for them. She replies no. Instead, Atla is causing chaos in the central area of the capital. Speaking of them, some Atla men have invaded Cal's shop and are trying to force him to sign a contract, which the blacksmith refuses. In front of the Iron Heart shop, a few men greet customers but tell them the shop is closed. They say the shop is facing some issues that need to be resolved before it can reopen. Though disappointed, people walk away from the store, still praising the men's politeness and customer service. Little do they know that those same men are nothing like they seem. They don't actually work there, they're just pretending to buy time for the other ATLA members to do what they need to do inside, until suddenly they hear a voice and become confused. Then they are struck without even seeing where the attack came from. The first one went down immediately, and the second had his neck twisted. Kane appeared quickly after hearing the noise and eliminated the intruders. From afar, the Fox Princess watches his movements. Next, the protagonist is attacked by more invaders, but he quickly counterattacks, not giving them any space to act. One of the attackers panics when he sees his companion fall and starts running, claiming the protagonist is a monster. Quickly, the protagonist catches up to him and says running is useless. No one is going to help him. With that, he says he's already dealt with all the external surveillance and asks if they can move on to the talisman installation phase. The princess says yes and instructs him to install them while keeping the recommended spacing in mind. Kane says he placed them all 92 centimeters apart from each other. She asks if he's already finished, since it's only been 2 seconds. He simply says he's very good at measuring distances. The princess thinks that this isn't a simple matter that can be explained by saying he has a good sense of distance. Even the Getsubu tribe, known for having the sharpest sensitivity in the second continent, couldn't match this, but she concludes that now is not the time to dwell on that, since the temporal formation has been converted into a standard formation. Everything inside the barrier will be completely isolated for approximately 10 minutes. During the full moon, this becomes a frontline force that crushes the enemy with power. On other days, they act as support, aiding their allies with formations. For the protagonist, this is perfect, as it expands his options, and 10 minutes is the ideal duration. As previously seen, inside the shop, the ATLA troublemakers are causing chaos. They're doing this because they want to force the blacksmith Kale to sign an exclusivity contract. They even threaten him harshly, saying that if the signature isn't on the document, his assistant will be thrown into the furnace, giving him only 5 seconds to think. Under such pressure, Kale ends up giving in and says he'll sign the contract. However, the ATLA member says he told Kale to sign the contract before the countdown ended, and since he didn't, he'll now have to hear the girl's screams as she's burned by high-temperature fire, claiming this is what happens when orders from their organization aren't followed. But when he hears the screams, he realizes that it's actually the other thug who's inside. Then someone appears and says that death by fire is the most painful. Kane says that with every breath you take, your lungs melt from the flames, and your nerves are continuously stimulated by your cells trying to resist. Because of that, even fainting becomes a trial. So until your final breath, you'll feel the pain of every cell burning away one by one. He hopes the thug makes the most of it, because this is the punishment he deserves, for evil will perish as it feeds the flames of purification for eternity. After that, the protagonist asks, who's next? After all the chaos is resolved, Cal reunites with the girl and apologizes for what happened, but she knows it's not his fault. Kale tries to give her ice, but Kane tells him not to do that, because her dermal layer was also exposed to the flames, and if she gets ice now, it will worsen her condition. He also says there's someone capable of using healing magic waiting outside. Through telepathy, he contacts the princess, who soon approaches and asks what's wrong. He then says there's a girl in need of healing. The princess immediately begins the process, but finds it very different to perform magic outside the temples. Regardless, she manages to heal the girl. Kale is surprised by the princess's healing abilities and praises her, but she gets flustered and says her skills don't even compare to Kane's. For his part, the protagonist enjoys seeing the princess in action as she exceeded his expectations, and he imagines she'll only grow stronger in her journey. Neriel approaches and says they only have 3 minutes to leave this place. Kale takes charge of the people in his shop and tells everyone to evacuate immediately. They don't understand why, after all, the shop is important. Kale then says that weapons and the shop can be rebuilt, unlike their lives. Therefore, everyone should focus on surviving. Kane, however, tells the blacksmith not to leave yet, as they still have unfinished business. The princess extends their time by 5 more minutes. The protagonist thanks her and is impressed by that. Kale says he made a terrible oversight, but given their location, it would be more efficient to go to the main warehouse and collect all the weapons produced in the shop. The princess asks how he plans to transport thousands of weapons. Kane shows an item and says they just need to touch it. Then a small box transforms into a giant creature, leaving everyone startled. The protagonist apologizes, saying he should have explained how it works before showing it. He says it's a mimic, used specifically to store valuable items on a large scale. The princess asks how he has an item that is a devil's legacy lost to history. Somewhat awkwardly, the protagonist doesn't know how to respond. Sometime later, more Atla henchmen arrive at the shop. Their leader wonders what happened there. He becomes furious upon seeing that the shop's warehouse has no weapons and orders his men to capture everyone who worked at the shop and their families, because he believes no one dares to oppose the Atla, fully aware of the consequences. Far from there, Kale and the others meet with the shop's workers. One of them says he heard that the Atla are going after their families. Kale apologizes for that, but his comrade says it's not his fault and that their families are safe. In a way, Kane is surprised by this. Neriel took care of contacting the blacksmith's families and got them to safety out of the enemy's reach. However, Kale doesn't know what to do now, since he no longer has his shop. Then the princess invites him to come with them to the second continent, where he can open a new shop. The blacksmith thanks her and accepts the offer, wanting to repay her with one of his masterpieces, but the princess says that would be too much for her. So the blacksmith asks for a favor. He says he needs a space to work because he promised to forge a sword that he must deliver before continuing the journey. A sword made from mistletoe wood, named Misteltein, and he will finish it in 4 days. Beside Barakel, in an abandoned factory, the princess can't believe this place could be suitable for a new shop for the blacksmith. Her friend tries to convince her. Either way, the princess asks if she has established contact with the other country. Neriel says that, at the moment, it's very difficult to make such a connection, and that if she's allowed to leave signal communication terminals behind, she can do it right away. But the princess says they can't do that, since they don't know which of the 13 terminals is being controlled by an Atlas spy. The 13 people stationed at those terminals, along with the first prince, are the 7 knights, 2 of the strongest warriors, and 3 high-ranking officers. All of them serve the Beast King and are prominent figures in the country. The only ones who know that the princess's mana is the source of her power are those 3 individuals. Therefore, no matter how long it takes, she wants to contact only the one person confirmed not to be a spy, the heir to the throne, and her brother. Neriel says she'll reach him tomorrow. In any case, the princess asks who Kane really is. Her friend says he possesses an imitator, a high-level artifact. The princess doesn't know his true nature, but she's sure he isn't on the side of evil, and feels fortunate that he's on her side in this matter. She thinks there's no way Lord Kane could be a villain, but wonders what that aura was that possessed him in that moment. 4 days later, Kane meets with Neriel and tells her she worked hard these past few days, saying he was helped by the traps she set up. She says she didn't do anything special and didn't expect them to be caught so easily. The princess appears and says they should get moving too. The princess says she would have been foolish if Lord Kane had gone with her, but affirms that returning as quickly as possible is important. Kane tells her to take her time with that. Neriel says that's not an option because if she's late, Lord Kane will end up solving everything. But Kane says it would be too much trouble to do everything alone, so he'll wait for her return. Kale says that Kane must not touch the sword until it's fully finished, and that he should have kept it himself until it was complete, and apologizes for that. Kane tells him not to worry about it, and says he's grateful he managed to finish most of it, because thanks to that, his dream came true. Shortly after, the royal airship arrives to take them to the second continent. However, Neriel notices something different about him, and when she sees that the princess is in danger, she jumps toward her. The enemies say the information Emperor Van provided is true, as they have located their targets. Soon, the princess realizes that, somehow, information about her has been leaked. The enemy leader asks if any of them were responsible for evacuating the Ironheart shop, but receives no response. He gets irritated at being ignored and says he'll extract the information by interrogating them one by one. After that, he appears with a circulation blocking device that only affects beast men and orders his men to activate it. But Neriel was already aware of the device thanks to everything the protagonist had discovered, and advises her people not to use blood circulation abilities. The ones in charge of the device are frustrated that it had no effect, but the leader explains that the targets aren't using their circulation. Soon, they attempt a more direct approach, and Neriel takes the lead to protect the princess. However, it's the princess who acts first, telling the others to retreat while she buys some time. The enemy leader claims that if the princess is trying to stop him, it's already too late. but the princess uses several talismans, and through them performs a massive summoning. The enemies are genuinely surprised when they see that the princess summons a spiritual dragon named Genbu, something only possible if one possesses the power of the four gods. Through telepathy, the princess tells the protagonist that she won't allow anyone to set foot in there. Kane wonders how long it will take. He can't afford to wait there for a whole month. She says the protagonist needs to return the Black Fang sword to Neriel, but he replies that he can't leave Nisteltine alone as he needs to protect her. While his men attack, their leader says that if he lets the targets escape, he'll be killed by his commander. He also says the airship is arriving and surrendering is the only option left. Then he asks Shi Vervistern what she thinks and whether he should give up. After that, the airship arrives at the location, and the leader orders his men to head toward it. Neriel tells the princess that now they should go, but the enemy leader says that, as expected, the princess can't maintain the formation over a long distance, and the moment she moves, it will vanish. He also says that it's an excellent decision. After all, it's better to be captured alone than to watch everyone else be annihilated. Neriel insists that the princess must not do that, and says she'll buy enough time for the princess to board the ship. The princess apologizes but insists on staying. Then Neriel says she'll have to break her oath. When Neriel became the royal guard of the Beast King, she made a vow with her beast blood. Once in her life, no matter the orders, she must obey. Knowing that, the princess orders her to leave and escape, no matter what happens. Against her will, Neriel says she will follow the order to abandon the princess and escape with all her strength. The princess asks Neriel not to forgive her, and says she is happy to have served by her side. After that, the enemy leader says it was a touching ending, and adds that if they're going to see each other again soon, there's no need to get so sentimental. Now he says it's time for the princess to release the formation and come to them, as he believes she's already at her limit. He also tells her not to worry, as he'll personally escort her safely to her destination. But distracted by his villainous monologue, he doesn't notice a sword being hurled in his direction, and he's hit squarely. The protagonist appears and tells the princess to rest now. The men see their captain fallen and wonder how it happened. Kane says he's impressed that trash like them can actually feel the loss of a fallen comrade. Some time later, the princess awakens in the middle of a void. She's still extremely confused, but she remembers one thing, her guardian, Neriel. The last time they saw each other was quite significant. However, the princess knows her friend didn't have much of a choice. Even so, she feels very guilty, so she begins to cry, apologizing to everyone, until the protagonist appears and says that she's finally awake. He also says that he gave her basic first aid with what he had, so he couldn't do anything too impressive. The princess, who until then thought she was hallucinating, starts crying again when she realizes she's really in front of Kane. The protagonist worries about her but says he prepared something for her to drink. She knows what it is, a powerful elixir that heals wounds quickly, and says she can't use something so precious. Kane received this elixir from his grandfather, who warned him to use it only on special occasions due to the item's rarity. And seeing the princess refuse, he asks what she wants. The princess simply thanks him for his help so far, but remembers that he had been protecting a sword. Kane says the sword is safe, as he used the mimic to store it. He then uses the mimic to reveal the sword Nisteltine. Upon seeing that the weapon is intact and secure, the princess feels more at ease. Far from there, on the royal ship, the blacksmiths chat for a bit. Kale says he feels guilty and claims that if he had finished his work faster, Kane wouldn't have had to wait at the abandoned factory. The other blacksmith asks if the work is really that hard. Kale says that the maturation process of a sword is complicated, but the real issue is mana absorption, because the more mana Nisteltine absorbs, the stronger it becomes, and it can become up to 5 times more concentrated. Thus, it would turn into a true divine sword. Back with the protagonist, the princess asks if something is wrong with his sword. Kane isn't sure, but he doesn't think anything bad is happening. He explains that inside the mimic, mana concentrates 10 times more than usual. This greatly speeds up the maturation process. However, he still can't use the sword, not until that process is complete. He also says this is the best time to attack the Atla base, since the central continent is practically empty now. And if the executives were present, they would have helped when the airships were attacked. It's likely that they are all far from the central continent, possibly on a different mission. So he invites the princess to go to their base and gather some information, as he needs her cooperation and support. Speaking of the Atla base, one of the leaders orders his men to find the princess immediately. He thinks he'll be killed if he doesn't find the princess within the next 3 days, which is why he's so anxious. However, outside, the protagonist and the princess have already arrived, and Kane notices the place is heavily guarded. But with the princess's help, he manages to block the cameras. Unfortunately, by sheer bad luck, they bump into some enemy soldiers. Kane, however, doesn't see this as a problem, as he takes them all down in a matter of seconds. Not just them, but the sword he was using also breaks quickly, as usual. Then the enemy leader shows up and asks what's going on. The last thing he expected happened. His target, the princess, is right in front of him. But before he could do anything, Kane rushes in with a melee strike. However, the princess stops him, claiming that this man might be useful. She then uses a talisman to make him say the access code. With that, they're able to access the enemy's system with ease and gain access to everything they need. The princess asks if there's any information about the invasion of the different continents. Kane says the invasion progress is shown in percentages. In the first continent, Atra is 99% invaded. He definitely didn't expect that, as he never imagined that the unified kingdom founded by his grandfather would fall in just 14 years. And he wonders what the hell his father is doing. Kane is furious and desires revenge against the entire Atla organization, even frightening the princess. But he apologizes for letting his emotions get the better of him. The princess understands and says the situation on the first continent is truly serious, and asks if the situation is the same on the others. Kane says the third continent is 11% invaded, and the fourth is at 48. The second continent is at 38. He also says that luckily, the Vistran royal family is in a place far from the innovations, but the princess says that doesn't sound like her brother. Kane quickly asks if she suspects the prince. She says only 3 people know about the return of the operation: herself, Nuriel, and Oni. The princess feels relieved that the misunderstanding has been cleared up, but Kane says it's still too soon to feel at ease, since Lady Nuriel is not aware of this situation. And if she were convinced that the first prince was a traitor, it could have serious consequences. It seems then that the princess needs to inform her father as soon as she reaches the second continent. If the Beast King imprisons the first prince, then distrust will be sown within the royal family. When that happens, cracks will form in the once unshakable sanctuary of the Vistran family, and Atla will seize the opportunity to take the second continent. She doesn't know what to do, as she can't communicate with her father right now. Kane then suggests going to the headquarters in Baraka. The princess says that place is Atla's central base, with thousands of members. However, Kane says that all they can do now is break through their ranks and secure a communication device. That is, before Lady Nuriel arrives in the second continent. Knowing that there's not much time left, the princess agrees and says they must act as soon as possible. At Atla's central headquarters, one of the leaders is furious with his squad, as they haven't located the requested information yet. The squad leader tries to justify it, claiming they're doing everything they can. The commander says the person they're looking for must be on the central continent, but he doesn't even know who it is himself, as he's only following orders from his superiors. Then, out of nowhere, another squad approaches. Their commander asks why they abandoned their post without authorization. They say the commander himself told them to return as soon as they spotted an intruder. That's why they came back. The commander quickly tries to come up with a plan. However, the protagonist appears right after, saying they won't have time to react. The commander asks who he is. Kane replies that he is the Reaper. Right then, the power is cut. Through telepathy, the princess says she's the one who did that, and, in addition, also activated the sensory enhancement from the talisman she gave him. The protagonist thanks her and charges into battle immediately afterward, gaining a complete advantage over the enemies. He does whatever he wants with them, until he finds a sword, and even knowing it won't be very useful, he's willing to use it just to further confuse his enemies, who by this point are already begging for their lives. From the control center, the princess watches everything, and even knowing that Kane is just doing his job, she compares the way he fights to that of a villain who enjoys killing people. This reminds her of the vision she once had of him, covered in a dark aura. Thinking back at that resting place, Lon was in a similar state. Back to the protagonist, seeing how everyone is quiet now, it seems they've learned to read the mood a bit better, and he says he's going to get bored like this, so he wants to make a proposal, claiming he'll spare the first person who begs for forgiveness, but only one will be spared. Immediately, driven by desperation, the remaining men beg for their lives. Thus, Cain says he planned to take them down one by one and didn't expect them to reveal their location all at once. Now, knowing where they are, he will kill them all. And that's exactly what he does. After finishing everyone off, he feels more tired than usual, probably because he focused his strength on hearing rather than sight. He also thinks the princess's talisman really sharpened his senses. Previously, she had warned him that with this talisman, Cain would be able to see through the darkness. Cain sees no issue with the talisman itself and wonders if it's the kind that uses mana from inside the body, a question he'll need to clarify with the princess. But as soon as he finds her, the princess seems uncomfortable and hesitant. She then asks if Cain was enjoying killing those people. He replies that he wasn't. However, the princess says that's a lie, since he purposely gave the enemies hope just to enjoy their despair, but Cain claims it was a misunderstanding. Still, before he could explain himself, someone appears and recognizes the princess. The enemy asks what she's doing there, and the princess recognizes him as Van, the Emperor of Thunder. Van says it's foolish to invade Atlas headquarters like this, and states that he'll make sure she doesn't leave. As he attacks, the protagonist realizes the enemy's plan is to keep him away in order to capture the princess. Either way, the impact of the strike is massive, and the princess is thrown far away. But ironically, the Emperor tells the princess not to worry because he doesn't intend to kill her yet. However, right after, the protagonist appears and tells the Emperor that besides his thunder abilities, he also talks too much. Then Cain lands a direct hit on him, making the enemy feel the weight of his strength. The princess asks if it's over, but Cain says it isn't. So he opens the mimic and tells her to use this item. She says this is a sacred item of the first Beast King and asks what he's doing with something like that. He knows his grandfather stole it to purify it, but said that one day this item should return to the priestess, since the first sacred relic of the Beast King has the power to awaken the dormant blood of Vistron. The priestess who receives it will undoubtedly become the strongest Vistron to ever exist. However, the protagonist says he'll explain the details later. For now, she just needs to use it. He also says he'll probably pass out after defeating the enemy and needs her help to protect him. Then the enemy rises, declaring the protagonist's death. So Cain tells the princess to stay behind him. The enemy attacks the protagonist, and he tells the princess to run. She feels bad for doing it, but still obeys and runs. The sword the protagonist was carrying, as usual, breaks. Soon, the enemy sees himself an advantage and says he'll end it. The protagonist says he thought about this after seeing what rank 8 was made of, but claims his opponent doesn't seem like a big deal. This enrages the Emperor even more, and he attacks. But the protagonist blocks his punch and asks if that's the best he can do. Van is stunned to see his punch stopped. On the other hand, Cain says he doesn't know how to throw a punch, so he'll teach him how to throw a real one. Right after that, Cain hits him with a powerful punch, and the enemy feels the full force shaking his body. With that, Cain says he put all his strength into it and asks if Van learned anything. Back in the control room, the princess wonders if she should really use the divine artifact, afraid that it might reject her, until out of nowhere she hears a noise. Some soldiers are running because they want to fix the security system and catch the intruders. With that, the princess thinks it's no time for fear and she needs to use the artifact now. Her father once said that the divine relic of the first Beast King is both a blessing and a curse. If the artifact chooses the user, it will grant them a great blessing. Otherwise, it will cost the person's life. That's why the princess fears using this item, but the current situation is practically forcing her to use the artifact even against her will. She remembers that the protagonist asked for her help in protecting him, and thinks she cannot break her promise to protect him. So she places the artifact on her head, and with that, the Vistron blood, the one that flows with devotion, sacrifice, and loyalty. The divine artifact declares that she has worked hard with devotion, sacrificed her own body, and swore loyalty, and for that, she shall be blessed. With that, the princess gains the powers of the artifact, and with them, she is able to see that the Emperor is dead and Cain is unconscious. Now she knows she must defeat these enemies and take the protagonist to a safe place. As soon as the enemies enter the control room, they see no one. But before they can realize it, they are ambushed. The princess attacked and immobilized them. Now she must do the same with the others. Back to the protagonist, he finds himself in a different place and tells she that this world is his by right. That means they are filthy thieves trying to steal it from him, so it makes sense that the right thing to do is kill them all. She says she can only pity Cain if that's how he truly thinks, and pities those born with no choice but to become villains, and she declares she'll kill him here and now. But the protagonist calls her the Queen of Beasts and claims she is the one who will die today. After that, the queen commands her beasts to attack. Cain, in turn, challenges them, saying he wants to see everything they've got. She doesn't stand still and attacks too. She hits the protagonist and asks why he chose to follow this path. Fallen, the protagonist thinks that every time he has this dream, it always ends this way. Soon we see that in the real world, he is still unconscious, and the princess has just found him. She knows that Nuriel will arrive on the second continent in 4 hours, and the communication device is broken. This worries her, as it means Atla may have interfered in some way. Either way, she decides to get some fresh air and ends up noticing the moon. She realizes her powers are active even though the moon isn't full, and concludes it's because of the artifact. Then she checks to make sure her eyes have transformed, because the problem that plagued her all her life has now been resolved by this artifact. Until someone appears and says that's quite handy. It's Starfish, rank 1 executive of Atla, and he says it reminds him of something. The princess asks what he's doing there, and Starfish says he heard of the Emperor's death and came to check personally. Soon he asks where Reinhardt von Euclid is. She asks why the enemy believes the supreme leader of the first continent is there. He replies that only Reinhardt would have the power to bring down the Thunder Emperor. He also says there are 3 people in this world who are overpowered, and only those 3 could defeat each other. The first is Atla's leader, the second is the sword god of the 4th continent, and the third is Reinhardt from the 1st continent. And the only one whose current whereabouts the enemy doesn't know is Reinhardt. But the princess says there's a misunderstanding, because the person he's looking for isn't here. But the enemy says she's working with Reinhardt, and there's no way she wouldn't know, unless he gave her a false name. That means he doesn't trust the princess. Then the enemy pushes her aside, saying she is in his way. The princess is thrown far. Starfish charges forward and calls out to Reinhardt, saying that this is the day he will have his revenge, and he has waited 20 years for it. The princess realizes this is bad, and she must protect Cain from this attack. But once again, the enemy warns her not to interfere in this matter. He then attacks, and the princess only survives because she is under the effect of the divine artifact. She thinks she needs to retreat, but she can't move properly. The enemy wields a spear as his weapon, which by his command returns to his hand when he calls it. He says the princess is interesting, but his target now is not her. With that, he attacks the cave where she had been hiding. Soon, the princess falls into despair, realizing she failed to protect Cain as she had promised. The rocks supporting the cave collapse, burying everything inside. Even so, there's no reaction, and even the enemy can't believe that Emperor Van was killed by someone so weak, who could be stopped by a mere explosion. On the other hand, the princess, enraged, vows to defeat Starfish. No matter what method she has to use, she wants to kill him. The enemy realizes that rage is the princess's fuel, but in any case, he claims he has no time for such a weak opponent. He then throws several of his spears in her direction. The princess is in trouble, as she's not sure she can dodge them all. Meanwhile, the enemy prepares to use his final strike to finish her off, until he hears something coming from the old cave. The protagonist finally wakes up and says he had a bad dream, and now he needs something to take out his frustrations on. That's when Starfish realizes the protagonist is related to Reinhardt and not Reinhardt himself as he had assumed, and he can't understand how a boy had the strength to defeat the Thunder Emperor. The princess is amazed that Cain is still alive. On the other hand, the enemy just thinks that the Shrine Maiden gave him false information. It was said that Cain von Euclid had been killed by his grandfather, but now he's standing right in front of him. So the enemy concludes that Reinhardt lied to the Shrine Maiden and to all of her people. Starfish decides that he himself will have to kill Reinhardt's grandson, since the old man lied to protect the boy, and he says it's only a matter of time before he gets his final revenge. He also says he'll deliver the boy's head to his grandfather. Cain responds by saying his opponent is as loud as Van, and asks if everyone from Atla is like that. The princess thinks Cain is still too weak to fight, but he tells her to run to a safe place, and thanks her for all the help so far. She decides to trust Cain and do as he instructed, and says she'll wait for his return. Starfish says the protagonist made a terrible choice and claims he'll never defeat him. Cain, however, says Emperor Van said the same thing and didn't live to tell the tale. So the enemy says that if Cain thinks he can beat him, he should go ahead and try. Cain then charges forward and faces the enemy's spears. However, he deflects them all. until, as usual, his sword breaks. His opponent even laughs, thinking he now has the upper hand. But Cain doesn't give up, although he's struck by one of the spears. The enemy boasts about it, claiming that no one escapes his metallic massacre power. This ability allows Starfish to destroy and control metal at will. Cain is bleeding and can't stop the wound, until he realizes the enemy can control the metal in his blood. Starfish says it may sound unbelievable, but confirms that he has that ability. He also says that the swordsman who split the sky is a skill he acquired to kill the tyrant Reinhardt. Cain thinks that this ability is like the side effect of the undersea treasure he absorbed. The only difference is that instead of dismantling, he's absorbing metal. However, considering how fast Starfish can dismantle metal, it's impossible for Cain to disassemble the spear while being attacked. If that's the case, the only thing he can do is strike first. But the enemy senses his intentions and says it'll be useless. Starfish forms a giant, spiked iron ball. He says his abilities are both offensive and defensive, and a warrior who uses metal will never defeat him. However, Cain thinks that even if the ability is strong, it must have a weakness, until he notices something and thinks it might be an opening. Cain says the enemy is adjusting the strength of each area of the protective layer by manipulating the metal. Starfish replies that even if he knows that, it takes only 0.1 seconds to adjust. There's no way Cain can break through. Then the protagonist asks if he should try anyway. He moves swiftly, attacking the enemy's defense from several different directions until he finds a weak point and decides to strike with full force. That way, Cain manages to break through the enemy's defense and hits him directly, launching him far away. Even so, he's unable to end the fight. The enemy gets back up and says his opponent knows how to improvise with a sword, but claims his body is covered in metal, so close-range attacks can't harm him. Cain sees no way out and even considers using magic against the enemy. However, he knows that's not possible, since his mana is depleted. Then he remembers he has something that might help, and even though he's not sure if it'll work, he'll have to find out the hard way. He grabs his mimic, the same one that holds the weapon Kale made for him, the indestructible sword, which is finally ready. Now he will have to use the divine sword Nistiltine in battle for the first time. The enemy asks what that is. Cain responds that it's the weapon that will bring this fight to an end. Starfish says that even without using a metal sword, Cain won't succeed, and throws more spears at him. However, the protagonist defends against them with his sword, surprising the enemy. Cain says it's too early to be surprised, because he still has more to show. As soon as he attacks, the enemy begins to realize that, indeed, the protagonist's weapon is proving effective against him, and he asks how that's possible. The protagonist simply asks what it feels like to be cut by a wooden sword. Starfish says there's an endless variety of prices to pay in order to use a magic sword efficiently. Considering Cain's terrifying speed, he assumes the protagonist paid for it with his life, and asks if his secret move was exchanging his life for that special attack. Cain doesn't know if the enemy misunderstood, but he states that this is not a magic sword. The enemy doesn't believe him, but regardless says he'll end it now. In turn, the protagonist claims he has never used his full power in battle since he was born. The reason is that no sword could withstand his strength. But now that this has changed, he can finally test his limits, and claims that with a single strike, he can finish the enemy, which is exactly what he does. Thus, the protagonist ends the battle, and feels great, because for the first time, he truly experienced what it's like to wield a sword with all his strength. Cain remembers that his grandfather once said swinging a sword was fun. He never fully understood what the old man meant until now, but finally he gets it. Now Cain figures the enemy must have some kind of information about him, so he searches the body and finds a memory card, and keeps it to analyze later, until the protagonist starts feeling strange, precisely because he lost a lot of blood during the battle. After that, the princess approaches, clearly worried, and Cain said she arrived just in time and tries to hand her the chip, but he faints before doing so. Cain starts having his bizarre dreams again, and his dream self is boasting, claiming he's going to reshape the world. But a woman approaches and says she won't allow that. Her name is Serena Soret, the light that pursues the truth. She says she will defeat the protagonist and return the world to normal. She also says Cain is insane and destroys everything in his path. In turn, Cain mocks her, saying Serena couldn't kill him. However, he tells her she can try if she wants. Serena grows angry and commands her army to attack. However, after the battle ends, both the protagonist and Serena are left fallen. She, even wounded and unable to move properly. asks why so many people had to die because of Cain, and states that if she could go back in time, she would kill him at the very beginning, until the protagonist wakes up startled. He sees the princess in front of him, and it seems the divine artifact has properly taken root. That's a very good thing. Cain also notices that she has treated his wounds. Cain knows he faced some really strong opponents, but he still can't believe he passed out twice in a row and had that damn dream again. Up until now, he thought it was just a dream, but it's becoming more and more detailed. He wonders if this is the future that awaits him, because if he's destined to destroy this world, then no matter what choices he makes, that won't change. But he doesn't know how he's supposed to live with that. Meanwhile, the princess tries to contact Miko but fails. Cain then asks if she's still trying to reach the second continent. She believes Atla made it so that none of the communications are working, and she's frustrated, especially after all the work they did to get the device. She wonders what they're going to do now, because if they don't have a code to connect, it won't be able to contact them. She also says that even if she had immediately arranged for an airship, it wouldn't arrive in time. That's when Cain asks to borrow the communication device. The princess asks what code he's using. Cain replies that she'll find out soon enough, until a voice on the communicator says he didn't expect her to actually reach out, and asks if the princess isn't underestimating him too much. She realizes it's her father. However, the man on the other end believes he's speaking with Reinhardt and is furious. Far away, in the Sorokasha Palace, capital of the second continent, her father asks how Reinhardt dares steal the divine artifact from the Beast King, and even left behind a rather ominous letter. Reinhardt wrote that he was borrowing the divine artifact for a while, but would return it later. He also told the king to take good care of the communication device. That's why, as soon as he heard the communicator, the princess's father became furious. But upon hearing his daughter's voice, he asks how she got Reinhardt's communicator. She tells her father that she'll explain everything later, but first asks if he's alone. Her father replies that he is. She feels more at ease, as she says she has something to tell her father that no one else can hear. After hearing everything, he understands that Atla is about to invade his kingdom and regrets not having noticed anything earlier. The king praises her work, but the princess says she wasn't the only one who uncovered that information. However, the protagonist stops her from continuing. Either way, she says her older brother is definitely not a traitor, and her father shouldn't imprison him. The king understands, but insists on asking how she got that communicator. Cain advises she not to tell the truth yet, so she pretends there's a problem with the communicator. The protagonist thinks he couldn't exactly tell the Beast King that the grandson of the Supreme Ruler had stolen it. He believes he managed to fool him this time, but now it's time to speak with the princess not just about the artifact, but also about the truth. So Cain tells Shia everything about himself. Now that he has said it, she realizes Cain is very similar to her grandfather. That makes him think the old man revealed himself to her on purpose. But the princess says he still hasn't explained to her father about the artifact and asks if it wouldn't be better to bring him up to speed. Cain disagrees, saying it's better this way. He knows the Beast King is known for his short temper and eagerness to fight. He would definitely try to kill him as soon as he finds out Cain has the stolen artifact, regardless of his intentions. In any case, Cain asks if the princess still has the memory card from before. She says yes, and the two check the data. He sees on the tablet the woman known as the light that chases the truth. This woman is one of the three constellations the protagonist is strongly connected to, and is also known as the Witch of the Third Continent. However, he doesn't know why the witch appears in Starfish's data, until the protagonist looks closely and sees that her name is Serene Soret, along with the rest of her data. Cain wonders why they would be investigating her activities now. He remembers her first appearance was supposed to be 7 years from now, and that she is the mistress of the Tower of Machines. Cain recalls his grandfather said she took over 10 years ago. In Starfish's data, the protagonist is listed as dead. He remembers that the enemy believed that and concludes that Serene must have told him, though he still doesn't know why. However, he says there's no time to worry about those details and just tries to copy the data, until he sees something surprising and alerts the princess. Shia notices that innovation in the third continent is at 0% and wonders if the information they found earlier was wrong. Cain thinks it probably was. It also seems they recovered all the crucial machinery that Atla had stolen from them. They even reclaimed the Ampule factory 3 hours after Atla took it. The princess asks who could have defeated them, because it should have been nearly impossible, unless someone knew the future and planned for it. The only person the protagonist knows who could do that is his grandfather, but he doesn't think he's the type to interfere in such matters. She asks what will happen now. Kane says first comes the elimination of the remaining executives, then the return to the central continent. After that, it's time to head to the other continents. He also says the big boss will return to the central continent as soon as he hears about the death. No one knows the true name of Atla's leader. They just call him the Absolute Chief, and they know he's extremely powerful. The princess asks if Kane intends to fight the head of Atla. He says that if he did, he would probably lose, and if he met him now, he'd simply die. He remembers the letter his grandfather wrote, which predicted exactly that. So he concludes that if it's true, then he'll need to come up with another plan, and fast. The protagonist says he has something to give the princess, and mentions that she gave him a talisman that enhanced his senses. She asks why he's still holding on to it. Being honest, Kane says he never activated it. That surprises Shie, as it means he fought alone and in the dark against multiple enemies without enhancing his senses with the talisman. Kane isn't certain, but says it's probably because he doesn't have any internal mana, though he doesn't feel the need to explain all that. He says that at the time, all of his senses were completely nullified. That's when the princess realizes that's why he had to use sound to indicate his position. Knowing this, she becomes extremely embarrassed and apologizes for thinking he was doing all of that just for fun. The protagonist says she doesn't need to apologize and states that this kind of misunderstanding has been a recurring theme in his life, but now they need to rest so they can get up early. At Atla's central base, they receive information that some of their members have died. To investigate the whole situation, 4 mid-level executives were sent to the crime scenes, but all contact was partially lost. After confirming the situation on site, all investigative members were declared dead. The perpetrator was deduced to be the same person who killed the Thunder Emperor Van, and the author of the report does not believe this incident was an accident, thus would like to request support from the high-ranking executives. But before he can do that, the protagonist appears and finds the Atla member alone, stating that it's a problem for him to still be alive. So he kills the Atla member, but before dying, the man manages to send the message to headquarters. Far away, another member analyzes the data and realizes that the Atla executives were defeated by someone much stronger. And if that's the case, he says he will have to see this power for himself. A few days later, in the center of Shuru port, Kane says that the remaining executives will show up at this port and tells the princess to stay alert. She says she can try to survey the area, but if the enemies are in disguise, she won't be able to warn Kane. However, he says it's unnecessary, since he can identify them with his ring. The princess asks if that ring detects a person's inherent mana. Kane says that's not exactly how it works, until he senses a familiar aura, one he's felt before. Then he realizes it's the sword god, Ryushuren, but next to him, there's an aura Kane has never felt. A dark aura surrounded by chaos. He wonders why the sword god is with someone so evil, until the sword god himself senses something. He then approaches the protagonist, saying he assumed it was an assassin welcoming him in the middle of the night. But that was a month ago, and now he's facing a mysterious but brave young man. Kane says that this is the same man who was watching him in Tenkuru. At that, the old man asks if that's all the protagonist knows about him, since he believes no one living within the 4 continents wouldn't know who he is, and he thinks the protagonist might be plotting something, though he sees nothing suspicious nearby. However, he wonders if this boy isn't with Atla, then why was he watching him? Until Kane calls him the sword god and says there's no reason to worry. He also says he didn't come there with ill intentions and claims he was simply looking for someone else when the old man happened to appear in his field of vision. But then, the girl appears and calls the protagonist a liar, and claims that their meeting couldn't have been a mere coincidence. Seeing the sword god's disciple and the priestess of fate together, Kane realizes that they, along with the light that pursues the truth, are the stars that form deep bonds with him, and according to his grandfather, they are the destined women he will fall in love with. Meanwhile, Ryushuren does not trust the protagonist and claims he is one of Atla's, asking for his master's permission to attack him, until her senior arrives and the protagonist sees no trace in him of magical transformation associated with the Jifril school. However, if this is his true form, there's no way the sword god doesn't know his true intentions. Kane wonders how he can hide this level of malice, and if he's using some unknown magic, only then would he have a level that could go unnoticed even under the observation of the sword gods. So he says a misunderstanding like this is unavoidable, and wonders if he'll be cleared of suspicion if he shows them this. Cain then introduces himself and says he's the grandson of Reinhard von Fuchled and the first prince of the kingdom of Euclides from the first continent. With that, everyone is surprised, even the princess, since she didn't expect the protagonist to reveal himself like that. The sword god sees the emblem of the royal family and asks if Cain is truly the grandson of Reinhard von Fuchled. He responds yes, and even shows the mimic he received as a gift from his grandfather. Then the old man says there truly was a misunderstanding, as he declares there's no way the grandson of Reinhard von Fuchled could be an assassin. Cain feels relieved by this. The senior student of the sword god apologizes for what happened, as he now knows that Cain is a prince and beyond suspicion. However, the protagonist doesn't hesitate and cuts off his head. Such an action was incredibly brutal and swift, leaving the master and his student in shock. Ryu Shuren, who already had intentions of fighting the protagonist, now becomes furious over what happened to her friend and charges forward. The protagonist tries to calm her and says she needs to know something, but the girl is consumed by rage and refuses to hear anything from him. Still, Cain tells her that this man was not her senior, and states that, in fact, he was the absolute chief of Atla. After that, the master stops Ryu Shuren from continuing the fight. He says that if the protagonist must be killed, he will be the one to do it. His student is stunned. The master says he will not repeat his order. Even Cain is startled by this. Not unlike him, Ryu Shuren goes quiet as her master commanded. The old man tells Cain he has only one question and states that he himself didn't detect any suspicion in saying. He then asks Cain what evidence he has to claim that his disciple was the head of Atla. Cain says he can't explain. So the old man concludes that Cain killed his student without proof and says Reinhardt trained his grandson poorly. He also tells Cain to apologize to Sign in the afterlife. Now the protagonist thinks that if he doesn't stop the old man, he will certainly die. Amidst this, the protagonist feels a sharp pain in his heart, and he wonders if his mana has returned, even if just a little. Cain plans to use it in the fight. Ryu Shuren sees that the protagonist blocked one of her master's strikes. The sword god thinks that this terrible sensation is the same one he felt in the forest before, and since Cain is capable of stopping his sword, his opponent truly isn't an ordinary child. Until someone interrupts the battle, cutting off the master's arm. While they're still processing what happened, the fallen body of Cyan, who was responsible for it, says that the head of Cain von Euclid belongs to him. Once, Cain's grandfather warned him that there was a massive criminal organization ravaging the central continent called Atla, and no one knew anything about its leader, the Absolute, neither his powers nor Atla's true purpose. That's when the protagonist realized there were things even his grandfather didn't know. Reinhardt said that the Absolute Chief was a being who should never have appeared in his grandson's future, and claimed he was sure this was an inevitable consequence that had come to distort Cain's destiny. So he advised him to be careful, as the enemy might have some strange powers even he was unaware of. Back in the present, the protagonist now understands what his grandfather was referring to, as he has witnessed with his own eyes a corpse rising. He then concludes that the Absolute Chief's powers are truly immeasurable, and that he is indeed immortal. Shuren asks if her master has somehow been enchanted, but he only says that the one before them is not Cyan. However, the body, even without a mouth, claims to be Cyan, and says he is the boy who was trained by the master since he was 11 years old, including when he got too greedy for progress and ended up hurting himself during training, or 8 years ago when Shuren drew her first map on a pillowcase, and even 11 years ago when the master first took him in, dying on the side of the road. Cyan, in a way, now appears with a new face, and says that all this time it was him, and states that he had been preparing for the day he would kill his own master. Then the master asks if he really is the Absolute Chief of Atla, because if that's the case, then Cain was right all along. Without waiting for any justification, the master launches into an attack. Sarcastically, Cyan praises his master's intuition, and says he should have used it to uncover his true identity. The sword god, for his part, thinks the Absolute Chief's power is beyond comprehension, and without one of his arms, it will be impossible to defeat him. So the master tells Cain to run as fast as he can, stating that he will buy him time. Surprisingly, the protagonist agrees with that. Unlike Shuren, who doesn't like seeing her master in that condition, but the master says he is entrusting his school and the fourth continent to her. So the girl, along with the protagonist, escapes the place. The Absolute Chief doesn't like seeing them flee. However, the master attacks him and says that he is the opponent the enemy should focus on. This way, the fight between them grows more intense. The enemy says that even without one arm, his master is fighting on equal footing with him, but the sword god tells him to shut up, as he's not in the mood to hear jokes. Until, in a brief moment of carelessness, he is struck by his master, and says that this is what one would expect from the sword god. In turn, the master knows that even if he cuts off the enemy's head, he will not die. With that, the enemy takes the opportunity to retreat, since he apparently has the ability to fly. From above, he prepares to attack and asks if his master will be able to stop this strike. The supreme leader opens a kind of portal, and from within it emerges a massive flaming rock, quickly approaching the ground. From afar, Cain can see the rock coming, and up close, the master seemingly accepts his final fate. He recalls that 70 years ago, he was merely a disciple of his own master. His master once said that what truly led strong men to death wasn't ambition, but rather the poison of women and carelessness. Therefore, he always said to never let one's guard down. He also thought his disciple was a troublesome kid, but eventually managed to handle him. What the sword god learned after nearly dying at the hands of his own master was to never drop his guard, and he also decided that, if he ever had disciples of his own in the future, he would take responsibility for them, and his right arm is the price for the carelessness of letting his guard down. Now it is his responsibility, as Sain's master, to believe in him, and also his duty as a teacher to eliminate his disciple. The master says he forged the sword he's using, and that this is his final gift as a mentor to his student. From a distance, Ryushorin still worries about his master, but the old man knows what he's doing. He then unleashes his final strike, and with it not only cuts the opponent in half, but also splits the massive rock. Seeing that the broken rock is still about to hit the ground, Cain says they have to get out of there before it lands. Ryu asks where they're going. The protagonist only says that the enemy is not dead. Unlike Cain, the sword god cannot sense the enemy's presence and doesn't know where he is, until he is caught off guard as the supreme leader appears, saying the master still has quite a bit of strength for someone who's lost an arm. The sword god thought he had severed the enemy's mana connection, but realizes that didn't happen. Soon, his former student says the master's sword won't be effective against him. He also says his magic was created for one sole purpose, to defeat his master. After striking the sword god with his special magic, the enemy notices that the old man is still breathing, even though his body is practically destroyed. But he says he'll quickly end his suffering. However, the supreme leader is suddenly struck. He sees it's Ryushorin and says he didn't notice her arrival, assuming the girl hid her presence with a magic circle. But filled with rage, Ryushorin tells the enemy to never say her name again. He says he's surprised that she returned as well, but that catches her off guard, as the princess was relying on her talisman. The enemy says it's a pity she came back, claiming her life could have been longer if they had run away, but she believed she only returned because she trusted Cain. Before that, Cain said there was a way to save the master's life and take down the supreme leader, and asked Ryu if she would accept the proposal. Back to the enemy, he says he didn't expect the protagonist to return as well. Cain had been using the girl's distraction to heal the master, until the enemy asks if he doesn't want to know why they're after him, out of all people. Cain says he already knows, in fact, because everything came back to him when the enemy summoned that meteor earlier, memories of dreams long forgotten. He also says the enemy wants to become someone like him, the true supreme leader. Cain says he's seen countless dreams, and in some of them, he had gone mad and was called the Destroyer. In others, he was called the Lonely King. More than that, he was also known as the Supreme Leader, who rained down meteor showers, wielded the power of the void, and, as the Supreme Leader, accomplished everything through the power of creation, to the point that he created an army of his own living weapons through the principle of immortality, and also became something that simply could not die, with power akin to that of a god, one who brought the world to the brink of destruction. That same power flowed into this enemy. Now Cain believes that the Absolute's authority is wishing to be his once again, as if it's trying to return to its original wielder. Even the enemy realizes that the power is leaving his body and going toward the protagonist. So he backs off before the transfer can be completed, and declares that he'll destroy Cain before he gets another chance to come close. With that, the enemy uses a spell that allows him to bring Niths to life, and with it he summons some shadowy creatures. But the protagonist isn't impressed and asks if that's all his opponent has. He replies that it's far from over. Soon, Cain realizes that the creatures he defeated are multiplying, and notices they won't die so easily. The enemy says he gave the shadows the principles of immortality and division. If they are killed or injured, they simply split infinitely. Cain knows that establishing principles is the final level of creation magic. It allows the user to create new laws of reality. Normally, killing the original body would be enough, but since the enemy is immortal, that makes the task far more difficult. So he asks the princess if she can use the sealing magic circle. She says no because her talisman was burned, but if she had more time, she could try something. Cain, however, says he'll take care of everything and tells both of them to run. He decides that, for now, he'll just focus on holding the creatures back and trying not to let them split too much. Until, in a moment of distraction, he gets bitten by one of the shadows. Cain attacks and ends up splitting it even more. He realizes the shadows keep growing rapidly. This is becoming a problem, but he can feel the power behind the wolves. The four energies used in creation, Adi, Koro, Bijane, and Sora. He then concludes that it's best to shatter the structure of their ruins into fragments, and remembers that this is the power that originally belonged to him as the absolute chief who once held creation in his hands. The enemy says Cain is even drawing power through the life forms he created, but claims that changes nothing. He also says mana is the issue. People say that when you look into the abyss looks back. Just as Cain came to understand him, he also came to know Cain. Then the protagonist realizes his opponent is right, and knows his mana is not enough. He can only cancel the enemy's magic for a short time. Even so, he thinks that if he can just hold on until the sword god is healed, the two of them might have a chance. But the enemy says that if he's waiting for the sword god, there's no point, because the magic he used on him follows the principle of death. Now he's just repeatedly reviving a yin. He'll likely be gone for good once the potion stops working. Cain can't cancel the sword god's death with the mana he has left, but he might be able to bend the principle just enough for the elixir to take effect. However, before anything else, he has to deal with the enemy first, and that's when Ryu Shuren appears to help him. She says she has the priestess's talisman ready to use, and asks if the protagonist is ready to act too. Cain replies that he is and tells her to wait for his signal before doing anything. After that, the enemy summons an even larger shadow and attacks the protagonist with it. Cain, in turn, knows that the weak point of these creatures is the small fissure that appears when they split, so he knows exactly where to strike. He waits for the right moment and delivers the blow, which ends up fragmenting the shadow creature. After that, he gives the signal to the princess. She then uses her talismans, and with her magic, isolates them, creating a magical force field. Cain thanks her, saying she was a great help. Now that the shadows are no longer in the way, he can fully focus on the enemy. The absolute chief has one of his arms cut off and tries to flee, but Ryu Shuren attempts to stop him. However, even wounded, he still manages to attack, telling the girl to get out of his way. He quickly recovers from the injury and launches another assault. But as the enemy charges forward, Cain doesn't just stand there watching. While the girl distracts the enemy, he focuses on the sword god. But the absolute chief notices and heads toward him. Grabbing Cain, the enemy says victory is his. However, as he gets close to the protagonist, he sees that Cain isn't dying. On the contrary, he's absorbing his powers. 15 years ago, when the enemy first obtained the power of the Absolute, naturally he also came to learn about the true owner of that power, Cain von Euclid, the real supreme leader. And if he let him live, that power would soon return to Cain. So, to prevent the absolute power from being taken from him, the enemy had no choice but to decide to kill him. That's when he founded Atla and spread his information network across the continent, all to find him. Since then, he's dedicated more than 10 years to killing this man. Cain asks if the enemy is saying he was born without ever having a chance to defeat him. The enemy says he must escape before the protagonist takes back all of his powers. After that, he uses 4-layer origin, creation magic, subspatial travel, until someone appears and says they won't let him go so easily. The sword god returns and says that in the middle of his fight between life and death, he realized there are no limits. Thus, it's only natural that there are no limits between space and time. And if there are no limits in this world, then there's nothing his sword can't cut. With that, the enemy realizes that his former master cut him even after he shifted into a different space. So if his opponent is telling the truth, this could be dangerous for him, and he needs to escape after erasing their memories. However, the protagonist stares him down and calls him a foolish thief who dares to try stealing his power. Upon seeing Cain levitating, the others are greatly impressed. Even the enemy is terrified as he sees the absolute power manifesting in the protagonist. Cain simply says he will deliver the proper punishment for all the sins of the false supreme leader. He then prepares his power and uses the ability heaven and earth creation, hellfire. The enemy panics as he realizes what awaits him, claiming that this is impossible. But Cain steps closer and says it's only impossible for a fraud like him, who all this time has only been using a fraction of the true absolute power. Cain grabs him by the face and finishes absorbing the power that was stolen from him. Soon, the enemy realizes that no matter how much he fights, this will be his end. So he falls into despair and begins to laugh. In the peak of his madness, the enemy says the protagonist will regret reclaiming the fate of the absolute, which he tried so hard to abandon, and declares that with this power, Cain will not be able to escape the fate of the absolute, because it is a curse after all, and claims that this won't be the end. Finally, the enemy uses what little power he has left and incinerates himself before his opponent can do it. Cain simply calls him an idiot and says those were the worst last words he's ever heard. Then he focuses and moves into another plane. There he sees a dark specter of himself. The shadow transforms into an evil version of Cain and claims to be the part of him that he cannot deny. It also says that as soon as Cain takes its hand, the power will be his once again. Thus, the protagonist stands before the power of creation and recalls what his grandfather once said, that no one can control this power except himself. With that, he attacks the dark specter, rejecting the power of creation. Cain says he only borrowed the power to defeat his enemy, but now he wants the curse of the world to go away, stating that he never wants to see that repulsive darkness again. After that, he returns to the normal plane and leaves behind all the power that was offered to him. And with that, he reunites with his companions. The protagonist says everything is fine and the absolute power is gone. From the sky, his grandfather saw everything and realized that his grandson wasn't consumed by the absolute power, and concludes that his final decision was not a mistake. After all, Cain finally showed his smile. Then, an angel approaches and says that he and the boy are alike. However, the old man doesn't like the comment and says he already warned earlier that he wanted to be left alone. He says that if the angel can see even the expression of his soul, it means he's been there the whole time. The angel says his soul is vibrant and full of color. That's why he couldn't leave him alone, and sees that there's a mixture of emotions inside him. But even so, they work well together. The old man says Cain has overcome his first mountain and no longer has any reason to be killed. He also says that because of this, he will give Cain his final gift. As he walks away, the angel asks where Reinhardt is going and thinks to himself that the man truly is full of secrets. Before leaving, Reinhardt calls the angel Nephilim and says that when Cain arrives in heaven, he will entrust him to the angel. Nephilim asks if the reason Reinhardt said all that was to leave Cain under his care. He replies yes. Then Nephilim says he will properly fulfill his role as Cain's guide. Speaking of the protagonist, he wakes up after a long sleep. He's a bit disoriented and doesn't even know where he is. Soon he realizes he lost consciousness again and blacked out. But when he looks at a table nearby, he notices there are some things left for him. Then the small mimic box approaches him, leaving the protagonist a bit confused. Not only that, but he also sees a letter, which surprises him even more. The letter was from his grandfather. It said that if Cain was reading it, that meant he had defeated the absolute chief. It also said that Reinhardt had placed inside the mimic the words he wished to pass on to his grandson. Soon after, Ryushorin appears and sees that the protagonist has woken up and asks how he's feeling. After all, he was unconscious for 3 days. Cain is surprised by the time, but says he feels fine. After that, the princess and the sword god approach, having heard his voice and coming to check on him. The master thinks that there seems to be nothing unusual happening now and wants to get straight to the point. He says that everyone witnessed Cain's transformation into the absolute. Not just his aura, but the power Cain used was that of the absolute. So he asks what the protagonist's relationship with the absolute is. Cain says that the reason he changed at that moment was because he absorbed the absolute side and its mana. He says this is a fundamental part of his strength, but he can't explain it in detail. But he claims the absolute power is dead and tells them not to worry. The master understands that Cain has his secrets and says it would be impolite to ask further questions. However, he understands that it was the absolute mana that made it seem like Lord Cain's fate turned out this way. He says Atla has already been eliminated and its remnants wiped out. The princess comments that the hidden spies on the continent also dispersed, making the second continent safe now, all while Cain was asleep. Cain thanks them, but the master says he should be the one expressing gratitude, because thanks to Cain, the entire fourth continent was spared from calamity. Ryu also thanks him and apologizes for her previous rudeness. The master says he will repay the protagonist someday and promises to carry his name and his sword. After that, they realize it's getting late and want to let the protagonist rest a little more. When left alone, the protagonist notices the mimic also stored his tablet and decides to take a look to see if his grandfather left any more surprises. As soon as he powers up the device, a new virtual space is unlocked. Inside, the system welcomes him and says it will now play the videos recorded by the previous user. Then, an alternate reality is displayed, and he sees a younger version of his grandfather. His grandfather says that this world didn't work either and that he failed to prevent Cain from awakening as the Absolute. He immediately blames himself for that, precisely because they are blood relatives. Because of Cain's innocence as a child, he couldn't bring himself to kill him. His mistake brought this calamity upon everyone. But next time he says for sure, he will end Cain's life with his own hands. After that, another alternate reality is shown. In it, Cain's grandfather imagined that if he killed his grandson while still young, he would reappear somewhere else. And even by taking the life of such a young boy, it wouldn't prevent the collapse, so he would need to find a new way. In yet another alternate reality, Cain's grandfather asked himself how many more times he would have to search for a solution. This time, he found three fates deeply connected to Cain: the light that seeks truth, the belief in honorable combat, and the seer who foresees fate. He believed that one of them would stop Cain. The three managed to grow into their destinies and kill Cain. Only a few survived in the process, but his grandfather believed that if he kept going, he would certainly find the answer to save the world. After 99 lives, he finally realized that Cain would always return in his path, with even greater power, as if it were the fate destined to him. Whether he fights desperately or passively in the end, the world will perish on the same day at the same time. There's not a glimpse of hope anywhere, and the grandfather wonders if all his efforts were in vain. Now there's only one chance left to fix everything. Through the 99 worlds, he acquired countless experiences and knowledge, and with that, he must now make a final decision. With that, he concludes that his best move is to kill his grandson while he's still a child. Because to him, even if another villain appears later, whoever it may be, it would be better than facing Cain again. But when he looks at his grandson still a baby, he doesn't have the courage to do what needs to be done. His hesitation keeps him from acting, even though he knows what will happen if he doesn't. He's seen countless realities, and all of them ended the same way, with Cain becoming the villain who destroys the world. And once again, he concludes that the best thing to do is to kill him now, before that happens. But he still can't do it, because at that moment, Cain is just an innocent child who has only recently come into the world. So when Cain grew a bit older, he revealed to the boy that one day he would become a great villain, who would even destroy all the continents. However, as the boy's grandfather, he said he didn't want that fate for his grandson, and declared that no fate would be strong enough to stop his grandson, because he would train him to become a man stronger than destiny. With that, the videos end, and Cain becomes aware of his grandfather's entire journey through 99 parallel realities. He realizes that the dreams he's had are actually glimpses of a possible dark future awaiting him, and wonders if there's no way to escape it. Next, the system reveals that the previous user left a message and asks if he wants to hear it. The protagonist replies yes. Then he sees his grandfather, who says he knows about Cain's future precisely because he saw the same thing happen 99 times. He also says he had to keep his reincarnations a secret for his own safety, because if Cain had discovered this and once again embraced the fate of evil, his grandfather wouldn't have been able to stop him. Until he was certain that Cain wouldn't be consumed by destiny, he had no choice but to keep it a secret. But now he believes he can entrust everything to his grandson. He tells him to listen carefully, because if it's true that the world's destruction has already been decided by fate, and if Cain has escaped the fate of evil, then someone else might take that place and bring this world to ruin instead of Cain. So the old man urges his grandson to grow stronger, to defeat the second absolute that will appear once more, and he believes in Cain, entrusting him with that mission. Thus, the message ends and the protagonist returns to the real world. He knows that his fate to become a villain has been undone, but he also knows that a new evil could rise at any moment. After some time, the master gathered everyone and told them they needed to prepare and listen carefully, because according to what he heard from his disciple in the second continent, the capital Sorakatia and the Vistran royal family had fallen. The princess becomes extremely nervous upon hearing this. The master says that the capital, Sorakatia, is currently sealed by magic. Communication with the Thunder Emperor, who went to the second continent, has been cut. Ryu comments that for the Thunder Emperor to do something like that on his own in the second continent, it must be a very serious situation. She says her family and Neriel should have already arrived in the second continent and in the capital by now, and they've likely already finished everything. Cain tries to calm her down, as the princess is visibly shaken. He also says the Beast King is not someone who would be defeated so easily. The sword god agrees and says the rest of her family is fine. Then he says they must depart immediately. The princess asks if the sword god will go with them. He replies that he couldn't possibly let her go alone, but the princess says the sword god should first resolve the issue with the sword gate. However, he says the supreme leader is already dead, so that can wait. Besides, Atla is weakened. Cain says they'll all help. Soon, the princess thanks them for their support. Not long after, they travel by airship. Meanwhile, the protagonist notices that the sword god is stronger than before. So he approaches and says that, in the end, he witnessed his fight against the supreme leader. The master asks if Cain was awake during the battle. He replies that yes, and even days, he was able to see what the sword god did and praises his sword swing. Cain says it looked like it erased the boundaries between life and death, time and space, common sense, and the absurd. Such was the astonishing motion. The master thinks that swing back then was beyond common sense. Not even Shuren would have understood it. He's quickly surprised by Cain's insight. He says that Cain saw through the essence of his sword, so he already understands the boundary between life and death at his age. Cain wonders if that's the name of the new state the sword god established. He also asks if the master can elaborate on this limit he mentioned. Then, a dragon flies close to them and surprises everyone. This is the first and strongest dragon ever born in the world. Its name is Evelake. Its mana is so powerful it can be felt from afar. The girls even sense that mana and appear concerned, thinking they're under attack. But the master says it's nothing serious, just a dragon that happened to pass by. However, what surprises everyone is that the dragon wasn't just passing through. It flies close to the ship and says it's not there to hurt them. Evelake says it came to honor an ancient pact made with the Vistran family, but it never imagined it would find the Apostle of the Apocalypse here, referring to the protagonist. Still, the dragon looks at him and asks if it should call him a singularity. Cain doesn't understand, but Evelake says it's just fate, and that he wants to have a conversation with the protagonist about it. Then, using its powers, the dragon pauses time to be alone with Cain. It says that Cain is now a singularity freed from his chains. A man born solely to endure the fate of the apocalypse has mysteriously changed. The one who triggered this chance must be someone involved with the shackles. Evelake cannot foresee if Cain's chance is a blessing or a curse for future events. If that's the case, it says it will devour him through the eyes of its contractor, Princess Shi, the contractor who inherited the pact with its old friends. Originally, the dragon intended to wait until Shi visited, but it had no choice but to break the silence now. That makes the princess a little nervous. The dragon says that the land of its friend, the land blessed by the heavens, now inherited by Shi, the descendant, is on the path to destruction, and if she doesn't act now, everything will be lost. So Evelake advises her to go to Theolaterin of Frishan and prevent the destruction, stating that, if necessary, she must use every means at her disposal to protect that land. After delivering its message to them, the dragon pulls away from the airship, and time resumes. Not only that, but they find themselves in a different place. Ryu says her head hurts and asks if they weren't just on the ship a moment ago. Cain says the dragon teleported them because it wanted to resolve the matter on the second continent quickly. The girl asks what they talked about. That's when the protagonist realizes that only he and she heard what the dragon said. Either way, Ryu says dragons don't usually get involved in human affairs, so if Evelake did, it must really be something important. Outside, they hear some guards saying that a thief broke in and they're searching for him, so Cain suggests they should leave before the guards show up. Then, a guard walks in and wonders if he left the window open. Out on the streets, Ryu asks where she and her master are. Cain doesn't know, but says they have to find them quickly. Ryu realizes they're apparently in Sorakatia, and despite the rumors, she thinks the place seems pretty peaceful. She sees they're near a market, and a vendor approaches, offering a sample of his food. The girl asks what it is. The vendor says everyone in Sorakacia knows about it and asks if they're lost travelers. Kane calls her attention and points to the castle, which apparently belongs to the Vistron family. But she mentions having heard that the city was isolated due to an abnormal mana phenomenon. However, the vendor says that's just a rumor. Then Ryu asks the protagonist what's going on. He doesn't know, but suggests they ask the people nearby. Ryu says this vendor doesn't seem to know anything and suggests it might be a false rumor, but Kane says it came from the Celestial Emperor. The most important thing is that the dragon sent them here, and the fact that no one knows the city is isolated is worrying. It could be more serious than they expected. Ryu suggests they might have created a barrier that directly affects the men, a barrier that prevents people inside from noticing anything unusual. At least 500 trained nin-level sorcerers would be required for a barrier of that scale. Kane thinks that's possible, even if rare, but imagines that wasn't the reason he was sent to the second continent. For now, he wants to go to the other side of the capital and observe a bit more, but upon arriving there, he is stopped by the guards. The protagonist argues that they are just trying to get to the other side of the city, but the guard asks why he wants to do that. He says there is nothing out there, even if they manage to leave. The protagonist then asks what that means. The guard simply says that the world is Sorakacia, and Sorakacia is the world. Not just him, but all the other guards repeat the same thing, in a way that makes it seem like they are under some spell or something like that. Near the border walls, the protagonist observes the situation. Then he decides to take a closer look, and realizes that there is indeed a barrier there. Kane knows it's a type of sound barrier, but he doesn't know all the details. First, she wants to find the princess and the sword god, since she is an experienced exorcist and knows more than him about barriers. Ryu then says they should retreat and try to find more information. Back at the market, she asks about the princess. One of the merchants says the princess died about 10 years ago, and Ryu immediately becomes worried about Shia, until another one shows up and says the princess they are referring to is the fake princess who was recently imprisoned. Kane asks him to explain more about that. The merchant says the fake princess invaded the castle and was imprisoned by the Beast King for insulting his family. Kane realizes that the memories of all the beastmen, including the king, have been manipulated. If they're talking about a fake princess, then she must be the true royal priestess. He thanks the merchant for the explanation and says he'll try to investigate. After a while, Kane tries to find out what the princess is doing, and Ryu asks if he plans to rescue her from prison and how he intends to do it. Kane says there's nothing to worry about because there's a secret passage, until he finds the place and counts on the help of the mimic for a revelation. Ryu asks what he's talking about. The protagonist simply says they've secured the passage and now need to enter. She asks how he got the key to an underground passage of the royal castle. Kane says that the revelation of Trackbus is a divine object from the heavens that has the power to connect spaces, and this is a secret passage that was made when the castle was invaded 10 years ago. Ryu gets worried, but the protagonist reassures her, saying this is just a family matter. He also says this space is connected to the castle, and through it, it's possible to reach the princess. They just need to walk a bit to get to the prison, until they come across someone, the Beast King himself. He says he didn't expect to find thieves there, and thinks the fake princess was just a distraction sent by them. So he orders his guards to capture the intruders. The protagonist knows he can't face the Beast King without mana, so he tries to argue, claiming he's not there to do any harm. However, the king isn't in the mood to talk and goes on the attack. Kane is forced to dodge. Then the king sees that his target dodged and says he's actually pretty good. Ryu in turn says that a surprise attack is not something one would expect from a Beast King. But the king says that thieves who invaded his home have no right to demand honor from him, and mentions that in his long life, he's always surprised by something. Either way, he declares he will never forgive them for trying to rob his home. Kane notices the intense blood flowing through the king. This is a technique available only to beastmen. It accelerates the blood circulation in their bodies, and with that, increases their physical ability. Seeing the king's attack, Kane realizes he won't be able to dodge it, so he'll have to block it. He thinks he now needs the principle of Bajiquan, since any attack can be blocked using that circle. So he does it, and right after, he tries to counter the opponent's strikes. But the king also defends and asks if that's all the protagonist has, even after invading his castle. Then, before the protagonist can gain more courage, the king states he will fight with all his might, and so he does, attacking with everything he's got. Kane quickly realizes he won't be able to block so many consecutive attacks. But before he can think of another alternative, the bones in his arms break. Then the king says it's over now, until suddenly, Ryu tells the protagonist to duck. She takes his place in the fight, wielding a powerful sword, which even the king finds surprising. Upon seeing the weapon she is using, the Beast King steps back cautiously. Kane, in turn, says the girl can't face the Beast King alone. However, she takes responsibility and says she will handle the rest. But when she attacks, the king defends himself. He takes advantage of her approach to counterattack. Kane had previously thought Ryu wouldn't be able to fight the king, but he realizes her swordsmanship has improved so much that it's as if she's on a whole other level. Moreover, Ryu is also using blood flow, but Kane doesn't understand how, since that's supposed to be a trait exclusive to beastmen. Their fight grows more and more intense, and Kane asks if she's been hiding her powers all this time. Ryu says no. She also says she didn't quite understand it herself. Suddenly, her body felt lighter, and before she knew it, she had figured out how to move properly. The protagonist wonders if she has just awakened, and how that happened, suspecting it may be related to the barrier. Back in the fight, the king says the girl's combat techniques feel familiar and asks who trained her. Ryu replies that her master was Gitame, also known as the god of the sword, and asks why the king is interested. He says he's heard that name before, but Kane finds that impossible and wonders if all their knowledge about the continents, except for the second, was erased. The king asks if this so-called god of the sword is connected to the Vistram royal family. Ryu doesn't know where he's going with that question. Seeing the sword she's holding now, the king says it looks like the sword of his royal family, something only spoken of in legends. He says their royal weapon was lost, and asks how a foreigner like her could be holding something so precious to them. Then the master appears, saying he tried to get there as fast as he could. He senses a dense pressure in the area, and says he didn't expect the others to arrive first. The Beast King sees the master approaching, and asks if he's Gitame, the one the girl mentioned. Then the master realizes the king doesn't know who he is. The king confirms this, claiming there's no reason he should know. Tammy sees that the protagonist isn't surprised, and quickly deduces that he already knows what's going on. Kane says yes, and that he'll explain later, but first he wants to rescue the princess. So the master tells him to go rescue she while he distracts the king. The king, in turn, asks if the master really thinks he can take him on alone. He also says he won't let the others leave that easily, but the master tells them to hurry, and so they do, cutting their way through the guards. Ryu notices that all the buildings are about to collapse and deduces that this shockwave must be something the god of the sword is doing to help them. She says they need to act quickly to rescue the princess. An hour after the event, they're all reunited. She thanks them for the rescue and takes them to a cave she says is safe. Ryu says it's a good idea to take shelter there and says she'll go retrieve her master. Once all four of them are together again, they catch up on everything that happened. Kane realizes that not even the god of the sword could hear the dragon's voice anymore. He tells the princess that their priority should be investigating the barrier surrounding the city and asks what she thinks. She says the barrier was created by just one person. She mentions that as soon as she entered the city, she could feel the heart of the barrier, but she noticed that it seemed to be influenced by human interference. Ryu asks what she means by the heart of the barrier. She says that every formation follows yin, yang, and the 5 elements. The center of it all is called the heart of the barrier. She says she noticed it immediately because there was mana annihilation. That's why the heart is where the barrier begins and where it's sustained. For multiple formations, there should be more people maintaining it, but she only saw one. With that, the master realizes they're dealing with a single exorcist capable of maintaining the barrier alone. This worries him. Ryu asks if they're all that strong. Her master says they're just a nightmare to fight, since they use every trick in the book to escape every time, and they'll have to dig deep to find them. She says that judging by the scale of the barrier, they must have around 4,000 different places where they could place the heart, and if they're that powerful, she might have to look for them in 10,000 different places. So first she wants to think about how to locate the heart, until Neriel appears out of nowhere, surprising them, and says she hasn't seen the princess in a long time, since it's been 10 years. Shia asks what her friend is doing there. Neriel simply says the princess always came to this cave when something happened, like when she was a child and set fire to His Majesty's mustache. Embarrassed, Shia denies that ever happened. When touching her, Neriel says she truly is standing before the princess. She is surprised, since not even her father recognized her and called her an imposter. Nuriel says the king just went mad with grief after losing her, and that confused his heart. Nuriel says His Majesty has held a grudge against her ever since the day he lost his daughter 10 years ago. So even if she swore she is the real princess, he would only become angrier. Clinging to empty hopes left him afraid and made him shut his heart. But Nuriel says she believes in her because she remembers the promise she made to She that even if the whole world betrayed her, Nuriel would always stand by her side. Ryu asks if she managed to overcome the spell, since even the Beast King failed, but her master says their bond is strong enough to overcome it. The girl then says she is lucky to have a true friendship, but her master reminds her that she has him as a friend too. Kane thinks Ryu Shuren might feel that way because her master is the only person around her. Then the dark clouds that obscure her talent should clear, and all the fair and shining stars should gather around her. He then says that soon, Ryu will also be able to find that kind of friendship on her own. The girl seems a bit confused, until, out of nowhere, Nuriel starts feeling unwell, and the princess tries to do something to help her. But the master says that the mana inside Nuriel's body has been distorted, and healing her could end up hurting her. So the princess doesn't know what to do, until Nuriel loses her strength, leaving the princess deeply worried. Ryu asks if this is happening because Nuriel resisted the magical barrier. Kane says that's what it seems like, until he notices something wrong and pulls the princess away from Nuriel. Kane sees some swords near Nuriel and wonders if they are the same ones he used in his third life. Nuriel changes her demeanor and asks how she dares pretend to be the princess, claiming that because of that she will kill her. However, before she can try anything, the protagonist stops her and asks someone to bring a rope. After that, he ties up Nuriel. Shia asks what happened to her friend. The master says the barrier might be malfunctioning. Kane says that Nuriel didn't yield to the spells of the barrier, so the immune system of the shadow world attacked her. Then she was brought back to life by the barrier. The master asks what Kane knows about this. The protagonist says he just remembered when he saw the shadows engulfing Lady Nuriel. These barriers, called the shadow world, absorb all living beings inside them and make them reborn as shadow puppets. In a way, she feels a little happier because she deduces that Nuriel and her family might return to normal once they destroy the barrier. Kane, however, disagrees. He says that when they were absorbed, it doesn't mean they're trapped somewhere. It's more like they were digested. With that, he states that Sorakacia has already been wiped out. The Beast King, the entire royal family, and everyone who lived in Sorakacia were absorbed and used to create this world. She is extremely shocked by this information, even fainting from the trauma. They ask themselves what they're going to do now. The protagonist suggests invading the castle and breaking the barrier before sunrise. The master asks if he even knows where the one who planted the barrier is. Kane says the shadow world is a ritual composed of 72 formations, 9 divinations, and 92 yin-yang, and 5 element ceremonies. Based on this calculation, the heart, that person must be in the Beast King's chamber on the top floor of the palace. Speaking of the villain, he watches Kane and says it's been so long that he had no choice but to live hidden to escape his gaze. But thanks to the message the Absolute sent him before dying, he found a way to seal the protagonist's path to eternity, and claims he'll make Kane spend the rest of his life in the nightmare that is the shadow world, while he intends to escape his fate and live however he pleases. As the true king of all creation, the protagonist says that the master of all creation is in the Beast King's private chamber on the top floor. That place is surrounded by shadow puppets that protect him. The one they must be most careful of among them is the Beast King, and they need to end this quickly. Before the master of all creation notices the attack, summons all the shadow puppets, and empowers the Beast King. Tomorrow, the entire Beast Kingdom will offer prayers to the first-generation Beast King. At that time, all the big shots, most importantly, the Beast King, will leave the castle. That is the perfect chance to strike and kill the master of all creation. And so they do, and soon encounter resistance from the guards. The Sword Master takes the lead in attacks, taking down the guards surrounding the area. He tells the others to go on, as he'll make sure to buy them time. After passing through the front gate, Kane looks at the princess and sees that she's fine for now. Previously, they planned to attack the castle and leave Shia in the master's care, but she refused to stay behind, saying she would join the assault as well. The master says she fainted after losing control of her emotions and asks if she's truly alright. She says the most important thing is that if they're going to invade the castle, they'll definitely need her help, so she wants to go no matter what. So they agreed she would come along, and they would protect each other. Cain entered this battle worried about her, and thinks that at the first sign of the princess losing control, he'll have to step in. Until, amidst a moment of distraction, they end up falling into a magical trap. Cain thinks it's the illusion barrier. It has a function that tries to send intruders into the void. Once activated, the illusion barrier is impossible to stop. In that case, he instructs the princess to activate the 8 lights matrix. Even with difficulty, she performs the procedure. The shadows were about to swallow everyone, but quickly dispersed thanks to the princess's magic. She realizes why Cain told her to do that. Her magic absorbed the mana surrounding them and dispelled the dark magic with light. Since they're facing such a villain, Cain is sure he already knew the priestess could counter the illusion barrier, but wonders why he would create it anyway, until he realizes something and throws his sword to the princess, saying she'll need it. Immediately, the dark magic returns and engulfs she completely, and through a magic portal, she is teleported. With that, Ryu says the princess sacrificed herself to save them. Cain confirms and thinks they're now on a kind of back path through the castle, and wonders if they bypass the defenses. Meanwhile, Ryu is upset about what happened and accuses Cain of directing the princess to sacrifice herself. He argues that he had no choice but to do that, and thinks he knows the illusion barrier's quirks better than anyone. Even in a past life, it was defeated by the priestess's 8 lights matrix. Cain feels guilty, and that's why he's going to rescue her from the barrier and apologize later. Ryu is surprised as she thought the princess was already dead, but the protagonist says no, she was just captured. If they're fast, they can still help her. So the two continue climbing the tower until a great impact occurs outside. Ryu comments that apparently the Beast King is involved, so the protagonist says they need to hurry. They reach the 7th floor and strangely haven't encountered any more traps on the way there, but the protagonist has a strange feeling about this floor. He says the Beast King's chamber will be the heart of the shadow world, and therefore, mana can't exist there. So he warns Ryu that if there are any traps, they must be on this floor, so she must be careful. Then they are suddenly confronted by someone who calls them villains and asks if they're there to assassinate the king. She immediately says she won't let them proceed, until Ryu recognizes her and says that woman is Tai, the shield of the imperial family. She's a monster, one of the 5 strongest in the 4th continent, equal to her master, the god of the sword. Considering her specialty in defense, she's on a completely different level. With that, Taite realizes the girl knows her. Ryu is surprised that Taite doesn't recognize her as well and suspects that, like the others, this woman has been affected by the evil barrier. The protagonist realizes that Taite has been the strongest pawn of the villain who took control of the castle all along. That's why the Beast King hasn't shown up to face them. In turn, Tente doesn't want to talk, and Ryu knows there's no way to convince her, so she tells the protagonist to go ahead and leave this fight to her. Cain asks if she'll be able to handle Tente on her own. Ryu says that would be kind of impossible, but she doesn't intend to give up now, and will fight to win this battle. While the two of them fight for real, the protagonist watches, and he definitely remembers Shorin using the sky style in his 3rd life. This is the Vistrom family's style. She awakened abilities from a previous life. Cain wonders if this might be related to the fact that he was the former master of all creation in his 3rd life. But Ryu tells him not to just stand there thinking about life. While distracting her opponent, she tells the protagonist to run, until he reaches the villain, who says he didn't expect the protagonist to simply ignore Tente and come straight to him. Then he welcomes him to his sanctuary and calls Cain the former master of creation. Claiming that he is the current master of creation, the protagonist approaches the villain and realizes that this barrier is one of the powers of creation, a trauma. The villain says it's impossible to use mana there, and also impossible to break the barrier because it completely isolates him. Therefore, he claims the protagonist won't be able to absorb his powers. Cain says he really couldn't do anything with the trauma, and asks if the villain is enjoying the conversation. He says he is, and claims that the protagonist arrived much sooner than he expected. Because of that, he says he had an idea and invites Cain to a game of chess. Cain says he's not a big fan of chess. However, the villain says Cain still doesn't understand which of them is in control, and that if he wants answers, it would be wiser to agree. Kane agrees, and the villain says that is indeed a good decision. After that, he moves a chess piece and asks what Kane wants to talk about. The protagonist realizes that this isn't a normal board, since the pieces move only by voice command. He then makes his move, and asks why his opponent chose a trauma, when it's only a part of creation. Wouldn't he be able to make a more perfect barrier by using all of creation? He answers that the other barriers are opaque. A trauma was the best choice because he wanted to see Kane suffer while losing. Then Kane asks if that's really the only reason. The opponent says this barrier is more than enough to stop Kane because the Absolute Chief told him everything about the protagonist. Kane realizes he's well informed and asks if that's why the villain used the priestess to lure him to the second continent. He also says that the Shadow World is a barrier that exists separately, without using the caster's mana, being unique and also a method that wouldn't drain his mana. It can also be sustained indefinitely, so he asks if the villain's goal is to trap him there. The villain says Kane is clever and confirms that his plan is exactly that, to keep him trapped there and live as the only master of creation. Kane asks if it wouldn't be easier to just kill him. His opponent says he wants to stubbornly follow the plan and die as the Absolute did. That's the most certain way to defeat him. Kane then says his opponent is afraid and asks why they're playing chess if he might have reinforcements on the way. Wouldn't this be a waste of time? The villain asks, even if Ryu and the Sword God arrive, what could they possibly do? But the protagonist says he's forgetting someone even more dangerous who is currently far away from them. Then he realizes Kane is talking about Shia, and he says there's no way she could escape the illusion of his barrier. Kane agrees with that, but only if she were alone. He also makes his final move in the chess game and declares checkmate, leaving his opponent stunned. Kane mentions that his opponent truly wanted to win, even if it was just a board game, and suggests one last match, saying he'll make sure to go easy on him. He even suggests starting without a queen so his opponent can enjoy the game too. Somewhere else, we see Princess Shia lying in bed, and someone is trying to wake her. She ends up recognizing the voice calling to her. When she opens her eyes, she sees her parents, and the king, seeing his daughter, is crying and asks if she had a nightmare. She is overjoyed to see them and calls out to them just like a child would. Her mother finds it strange, since she's already too old for that.
Our video ends here. If you enjoyed it, please like and subscribe to the channel. Until next time, bye bye.